Carl Jung explained, "Nothing can hurt you anymore when you know this truth. There exists a place beyond the reach of ordinary understanding, where the soul encounters its most profound teacher, not in the halls of wisdom or the sanctuaries of peace, but in the crucible of its deepest anguish. Here, where tears become prayers and wounds transform into gateways, we discover what Carl Jung called the great secret, that consciousness itself is indestructible, and within this recognition lies our path to absolute invulnerability. You who have walked through valleys where shadows seemed permanent, who have felt the weight of existence press upon your chest until breathing became a conscious act of rebellion against despair. You know this territory. You have mapped its contours with your tears, measured its depths with your sleepless nights. But what if I told you that every moment of suffering has been preparing you for the most magnificent discovery of your existence? What if the very pain that seemed to threaten your survival has been carving out space within you for something indestructible to emerge? Jung found himself in such a place during his confrontation with the unconscious, that dark night of the soul that lasted nearly 4 years. In his Red Book, he chronicled this descent into madness and meaning, where the structures of his rational mind collapsed like ancient buildings in an earthquake. Yet it was precisely in this collapse that he discovered what cannot be collapsed, what remains when everything else falls away. He called it the self, not the small self of ego and personality, but the eternal witness that observes all experiences without being diminished by any of them. This is where we must begin our journey together, in the recognition that you are not your suffering. You are the one who experiences suffering. You are not your fear. You are the awareness in which fear appears and disappears. You are not your thoughts, your emotions, your circumstances, or even your history. You are the unchanging consciousness in which all these phenomena arise like waves upon the ocean of being. The Great Awakening begins with a simple yet revolutionary shift in identification. For most of our lives, we believe ourselves to be the characters in our personal drama, the victim, the hero, the one who succeeds or fails, loves or loses, hopes or despairs. We invest so completely in these roles that when they are threatened, we feel as though we ourselves are under attack. When they are wounded, we believe we are wounded. When they are broken, we believe we are broken. But Jung discovered what the mystics have known across centuries. There is something in us that cannot be wounded, cannot be broken, cannot be diminished by any experience whatsoever. This something is not a thing at all, but the very capacity for experience itself. Consciousness, pure and simple. It is the screen upon which all movies of life are projected, remaining untouched by the dramas that play across its surface. Consider the metaphor of a mirror. When a mirror reflects a scene of destruction, is the mirror itself destroyed? When it shows images of ugliness, does the mirror become ugly? When it reflects chaos, does the mirror become chaotic? Of course not. The mirror remains pristine, unchanged, capable of reflecting whatever appears before it with perfect neutrality. This is the nature of consciousness, and this is what you truly are. Yet this recognition does not come easily to the human psyche, conditioned as it is to identify with the contents of experience rather than the container. We have been taught to believe that we are our stories, our wounds, our victories and defeats. We have learned to derive our sense of identity from the temporary forms that arise and pass away in the field of awareness. This identification is what Buddha called the first noble truth, the truth of suffering. It is what Jung understood as the fundamental problem of the ego's attachment to its own created reality. The ego, in Jung's understanding, is not evil or wrong. It is simply limited. It is the part of the psyche that must create boundaries, categories, and stories in order to function in the world of time and space. It is necessary for practical life, for making decisions, for navigating relationships and responsibilities. But when the ego believes itself to be the totality of who we are, it becomes a prison rather than a tool. This is why suffering is so deeply connected to our identification with the ego's perspective. When we believe we are only the ego, we feel vulnerable to every change in circumstance, threatened by every challenge to our self-image, devastated by every loss of what we thought we needed for happiness. We live in a constant state of potential emergency, always defending against threats to our constructed identity. But what if there were nothing to defend? What if the very thing you think needs protection is actually indestructible? What if your true nature is so fundamental to existence itself that it cannot be harmed by anything that appears within existence? This is the profound shift that Jung called the realization of the self. It is not something we achieve or attain, but something we recognize was always already present. It is like suddenly realizing that you have been searching for your glasses while they were on your head all along. The self, consciousness itself, has never been absent. We have simply been looking for it in the wrong places, trying to find our identity in the temporary forms rather than in the formless awareness that perceives all forms. When this recognition dawns, something extraordinary happens to our relationship with suffering. We do not become immune to pain, nor do we lose our capacity for appropriate emotional response. Rather, we discover that we can experience the full range of human emotions and sensations without being identified with them. We can feel sadness without believing we are sad people. We can experience fear without believing we are in fundamental danger. We can encounter loss without believing we are diminished. This is what Jung meant when he spoke of the transcendent function, the capacity of consciousness to contain opposites without being torn apart by them. When we know ourselves as awareness itself, we become like the sky that can hold both storms and sunshine, both clouds and clear blue space, without being fundamentally altered by any weather pattern that passes through. The awakening to this truth often comes through what Jung called enantiodromia, the process by which everything transforms into its opposite. Our greatest suffering becomes our greatest teacher. Our deepest wounds become our most sacred openings. Our most humbling defeats become our most liberating victories. This is not poetic metaphor, but psychological fact. The psyche has a natural tendency to seek wholeness, and often it uses apparent destruction as the pathway to authentic reconstruction. Think of the caterpillar in its chrysalis. From the outside, it appears that the caterpillar is dying, dissolving into undifferentiated mush. But what is actually happening is far more miraculous. The caterpillar is being reorganized at the cellular level, its very substance being transformed into something capable of flight. The dissolution is not destruction, but metamorphosis, not death, but rebirth into a higher order of being. This is what happens when we allow ourselves to fully experience our suffering without resistance, without the desperate attempt to escape or fix or change what is arising in the moment. In this complete acceptance, not passive resignation, but active embrace of what is, we discover that consciousness itself is not threatened by any experience. We find that we can meet whatever arises with an unshakable presence that transforms everything it touches. The great secret that Jung discovered, and that countless awakened beings throughout history have rediscovered, is that invulnerability is not about becoming hard or defended. True invulnerability comes from realizing that there is nothing to defend. When we know ourselves as the indestructible awareness that witnesses all experience, we become immune not to experience itself, but to the suffering that comes from misidentifying with temporary experiences. This is why Jung insisted that the goal of psychological development is not to eliminate the shadow, not to transcend all problems, not to achieve a state of perpetual happiness. The goal is individuation, becoming who we truly are, which includes embracing the full spectrum of human experience from a place of unshakable centeredness in our essential nature. From this centered place, we can engage fully with life without being at the mercy of life's inevitable changes. We can love deeply without being destroyed by loss. We can pursue meaningful goals without being devastated by failure. We can feel anger without being consumed by rage, experience sadness without drowning in depression, encounter fear without being paralyzed by terror. This transformation does not happen overnight, nor does it happen through mere intellectual understanding. It requires what Jung called the opus contra naturam, work against nature, meaning against the natural tendency of the ego to identify with its experiences. It requires the courage to question our most basic assumptions about who we are, the willingness to let go of identities that have served us in the past but now limit our growth, and the patience to allow this recognition to mature slowly in the depths of our being. The process often feels like death before it feels like birth. This is because something does indeed die in the awakening to our true nature, the false self, the constructed identity, the ego's belief in its own ultimate reality. But what dies was never truly alive to begin with. It was always a case of mistaken identity, a dream from which we are finally willing to wake. As this awakening deepens, we begin to recognize the same indestructible consciousness in others, even when they themselves do not recognize it. We see beyond their personas and defenses to the eternal awareness that is their true nature. This recognition naturally generates compassion, not as a moral imperative, but as a spontaneous response to seeing clearly. When we know ourselves as consciousness, we cannot help but recognize consciousness wherever it appears to be hiding behind the masks of personality and circumstance. This is the beginning of what Jung called the religious attitude, not necessarily belief in any particular doctrine or deity, but a profound reverence for the mystery of consciousness itself. We begin to sense that we are not isolated individuals struggling alone in a hostile universe, but expressions of one infinite awareness, exploring itself through countless forms and experiences. From this perspective, even our suffering reveals itself as sacred, not because suffering is inherently good, but because consciousness can transform any experience into wisdom, any pain into compassion, any darkness into illumination. The alchemical fire of awareness turns the lead of our most difficult experiences into the gold of deepened understanding and expanded capacity for love. This is why Jung could write, even in his darkest hours, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." He understood that every experience, no matter how challenging, is an opportunity for this becoming, this gradual recognition of our indestructible nature. Every moment of suffering contains within it the seed of liberation, not from experience itself, but from the illusion of separation that makes us believe we are at the mercy of our experiences. As we begin to live from this recognition, life becomes not easier necessarily, but infinitely more meaningful. We discover that we have within us the capacity to meet whatever arises with presence, wisdom, and an unshakable peace that does not depend on external circumstances aligning with our preferences. We find that we can be agents of healing and transformation in the world, not from a place of trying to fix what is broken, but from an overflow of the wholeness we have recognized within ourselves. The Great Awakening, then, is not about achieving some special state or acquiring some new ability. It is about remembering what we have always been beneath all the layers of conditioning, beneath all the stories of limitation and separation. beneath all the identifications with temporary forms. It is about coming home to the awareness that has never been absent, never been damaged, never been anything less than perfect and complete. This recognition transforms everything while changing nothing essential. The same experiences may continue to arise: joy and sorrow, success and failure, love and loss. But our relationship to these experiences is fundamentally altered. We meet them from a place of unshakable presence rather than reactive identification. We dance with them rather than being danced by them. We use them as opportunities for deeper recognition rather than evidence of our vulnerability. In this great awakening, we discover that what we had been seeking all along was never absent. The peace we longed for is our very nature. The love we yearn to receive is what we are made of. The freedom we hope to achieve is the natural state of consciousness itself. We had been like someone frantically searching for water while standing in the middle of the ocean, unable to recognize that what we sought was all around us and within us in every moment. Jung's great gift to humanity was this map back to our essential nature, this clear articulation of the journey from identification with the ego to recognition of the self. He showed us that the very experiences that seem to threaten our well-being are actually the pathway to discovering what cannot be threatened. He revealed that our deepest wounds often become our greatest sources of wisdom, our most challenging experiences, our most profound teachers. As we stand at the threshold of this recognition, we begin to sense the vast adventure that awaits us, not in some distant future, but in this very moment, in the depths of our own being. We sense that beyond the veil of our familiar suffering lies a realm of unimaginable freedom, creativity, and love. We begin to understand that we have been citizens of this realm all along, but had forgotten our true identity in the drama of our human experience. This is where our journey together begins, with this recognition that you are not your suffering, but the one who experiences it. You are not your story, but the one who tells it. You are not your limitations, but the unlimited awareness in which all limitations appear. From this foundation of unshakable being, we will explore the vast territories of the psyche, discovering how each aspect of our inner world serves the grand purpose of awakening to our true nature. The Great Awakening calls to you now, not as something to be achieved in the future, but as a recognition available in this very moment. Can you sense it? Can you feel the presence that has been with you through every joy and sorrow, every triumph and defeat? Can you recognize the awareness that has never been touched by any experience, that has been your constant companion through every change in circumstance? This awareness is what you are, and in knowing this, invulnerability ceases to be a goal and reveals itself as your birthright. Imagine, if you will, an ancient cartographer standing at the edge of an unexplored continent, compass in hand, preparing to map territories that no human has ever charted. This was Jung's position as he gazed into the vast inner landscape of the human psyche, recognizing that what we casually call mind or self is actually an intricate kingdom of archetypal inhabitants, each with their own agenda, their own voice, their own essential role in the grand theater of consciousness. What he discovered in those depths would revolutionize our understanding of who we are. For Jung revealed that the psyche is not a simple, unified entity, but a complex ecosystem of interrelated forces, some conscious, some unconscious, some personal, some collective. Like a master architect examining the blueprint of a cathedral, he mapped the structural elements that support the magnificent edifice of human consciousness, showing us that understanding this inner architecture is the key to transcending psychological suffering. You see, Most of us live our entire lives believing we are simply one person, one continuous identity moving through time. We wake up each morning assuming we are the same self that went to sleep the night before. But Jung's exploration revealed something far more mysterious and wonderful. What we call self is actually a small island of conscious awareness, floating in a vast ocean of unconscious depths, surrounded by currents and tides of which we remain largely unaware. This small island is what Jung termed the ego, not in the popular sense of arrogance or self-importance, but as the center of conscious identity, the part of us that says I and believes in its own continuity through time. The ego is the narrator of our personal story, the one who remembers yesterday and plans for tomorrow, who makes decisions and takes credit for successes, who worries about failures and dreams of future triumphs. The ego is not our enemy, despite what some spiritual traditions might suggest. It is absolutely necessary for functioning in the world of time and space, for maintaining relationships, for pursuing goals, for learning and growing through experience. Without a functioning ego, we would be unable to distinguish between self and other, unable to make choices, unable to learn from consequences or plan for the future. But the ego becomes problematic when it mistakes itself for the totality of who we are. When the ego believes it is the entire kingdom rather than merely the visible castle on the hill, it begins to live in constant fear of threats to its sovereignty. It develops elaborate defense systems, builds higher walls, creates more sophisticated strategies for maintaining control over its domain. And in doing so, it cuts itself off from the very sources of wisdom and power that could actually ensure its well-being. For surrounding this island of ego consciousness, extending far beyond what the ego can perceive, lies the vast archipelago of the unconscious. Jung distinguished between the personal unconscious, containing all the experiences, memories, and aspects of ourselves that we have forgotten or repressed, and the collective unconscious, that deeper stratum of psyche that contains the inherited patterns and potentials common to all humanity. Within this unconscious realm dwell what Jung called the archetypes, primordial images and patterns that have shaped human experience since the dawn of consciousness itself. These are not abstract concepts, but living energies, autonomous complexes that can influence our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors in powerful ways. They are the gods and goddesses of the inner world, each representing essential aspects of the human experience. Consider the persona, that carefully constructed mask we wear in social situations. The word itself comes from the Latin for the masks worn by actors in ancient theater, and this etymology reveals the persona's essential nature. It is the role we play in the world, the acceptable face we present to society, the version of ourselves we believe will gain approval, success, or survival in our particular culture and circumstances. The persona is absolutely necessary for social functioning. We all need the ability to adapt our presentation to different contexts, to meet the expectations of various relationships and roles. The problem arises when we become completely identified with our persona, when we forget that it is a role we are playing rather than who we truly are. When this happens, we begin to live our entire lives on the surface, cut off from our authentic depths, constantly exhausted by the effort of maintaining an image that may have little connection to our true nature. In the depths below conscious awareness lurks the shadow, perhaps the most misunderstood of all the archetypal forces. The shadow is not evil incarnate, though it certainly can contain aspects of ourselves that we find morally objectionable. Rather, the shadow is the repository of all the aspects of our potential that we have rejected, denied, or simply never developed. It contains not only our capacity for darkness, but also our unlived life, our disowned talents, our forbidden desires, our authentic power that we were taught was unacceptable. The shadow forms through a natural process of psychological development. As children, we quickly learn which aspects of our nature receive approval and which meet with disapproval, punishment, or abandonment. The unapproved aspects don't disappear. They sink into the unconscious, where they continue to influence our lives in ways we don't recognize. They appear in our projections onto others, in our inexplicable reactions to certain types of people, in our dreams and fantasies, in the qualities we most despise in the world around us. Jung realized that the shadow holds the key to psychological wholeness. What we resist in ourselves becomes the source of our external suffering. The very qualities we most vehemently reject in others are often precisely the disowned aspects of our own nature seeking recognition and integration. The person who triggers our deepest anger or judgment is often showing us something about ourselves we are not yet ready to acknowledge. But the shadow is not only about darkness. Often what we have cast into shadow are our brightest potentials, our creativity, our authentic power, our capacity for joy, our natural confidence. Many people, especially those raised in environments that discouraged standing out or expressing their full potential, carry what Jung called the golden shadow, the unlived magnificence that was deemed too dangerous or socially unacceptable to express. Working with the shadow is not about acting out every repressed impulse or embracing destructive behaviors. It is about developing what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold the tension between opposing forces within ourselves until a third way emerges that includes the wisdom of both. It is about befriending the exile within, learning to channel shadow energies in creative and constructive ways. Then there are the Anima and animus, the contra-sexual archetypes that represent the inner feminine in men and the inner masculine in women. These are not about gender roles or sexual orientation, but about fundamental approaches to consciousness and relationship. The Anima represents receptivity, intuition, emotional depth, the capacity for relationship and meaning-making. The animus represents focus, analysis, decisive action, the capacity for structure and achievement. Every complete human being contains both of these archetypal energies, regardless of biological gender. The problems arise when we over-identify with one pole and reject the other, or when we project these energies onto external partners, expecting them to carry what we have not developed within ourselves. The man who has rejected his inner feminine becomes rigid, disconnected from his emotional life, unable to access intuition or create meaningful relationships. The woman who has rejected her inner masculine becomes unable to set boundaries, to focus her energy, to take decisive action in service of her vision. The integration of Anima and Animus is essential for psychological wholeness. When we reclaim these inner partners, we become complete unto ourselves, capable of both receptive wisdom and focused action, both emotional depth and clear thinking. We stop seeking completion through external relationships and begin to relate from wholeness rather than neediness. All of these archetypal forces, ego, persona, shadow, anima, animus, dance together in the theater of consciousness, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in conflict, always in service of what Jung considered the central organizing principle of the psyche, the self with a capital S. The self is not another archetype among many, but the archetype of archetypes, the central point around which all other psychological content organizes itself. The self represents our essential wholeness, the unity that contains and transcends all psychological polarities. It is simultaneously the center and the circumference of our being, both the destination of psychological development and the source from which that development unfolds. Jung often represented the self through images of mandalas, circular symbols that appear spontaneously in the dreams and artwork of individuals undergoing deep psychological transformation. But here is the crucial insight that Jung discovered, the secret that transforms our relationship to psychological suffering. The self is not something we need to create or achieve. It is what we have always been underneath all the archetypal drama. The self is synonymous with what we explored in our first chapter, the indestructible awareness that witnesses all psychological weather without being fundamentally altered by it. The ego, persona, shadow, anima, and animus are all temporary formations within the field of consciousness, like clouds appearing and dissolving in the infinite sky of awareness. They are real and important, deserving of respect and understanding, but they are not what we ultimately are. They are the characters in our psychological play, but we are the stage upon which the play is performed. This recognition transforms our entire approach to psychological work. Instead of trying to eliminate difficult emotions or perfect our personality, we learn to provide space for all aspects of our psyche to exist and express themselves appropriately. Instead of identifying with any single archetypal energy, we learn to serve as conscious host to the entire inner community. From this perspective, psychological symptoms and conflicts are not problems to be solved, but invitations to greater wholeness. When we experience internal conflict, it is often because different archetypal energies are vying for attention, each carrying important information about our development. The depression that seems to crush our spirit may be the shadow demanding recognition of our unlived life. The anxiety that paralyzes our action may be the anima or animus, calling us to develop capacities we have been afraid to claim. The anger that consumes our relationships may be the shadow of our authentic power seeking appropriate expression. Understanding the architecture of the psyche gives us a completely different framework for working with psychological difficulties. Instead of pathologizing our inner conflicts, we begin to see them as the natural tension of growth, the creative friction that generates new possibilities. Instead of trying to maintain a smooth, consistent personality, we learn to navigate the complex ecosystem of our inner world with curiosity and compassion. This shift in perspective is liberating beyond measure. When we know ourselves as the consciousness that contains all archetypal energies rather than identifying with any particular configuration of them, we become immune to the suffering that comes from psychological fragmentation. We can experience the full range of human emotions and archetypal activations without being overwhelmed by them. The persona can arise to meet social requirements without us forgetting our deeper nature. The shadow can emerge with its gifts and challenges without us being consumed by shame or projection. The anima and animus can guide us toward greater balance and integration without us losing our authentic center. The ego can perform its necessary functions without believing it must control everything in order to be safe. This is what Jung meant by individuation, not the development of a perfect personality, but the realization of our essential wholeness that includes all aspects of our psychological nature. Individuation is the process of becoming conscious of the archetypal forces operating within us, learning to relate to them skillfully, and ultimately recognizing ourselves as the awareness that provides space for all of them to exist. In this recognition, we discover something remarkable about psychological suffering. Most of our pain comes not from the archetypal energies themselves, but from our resistance to them. Our attempt to maintain a narrow identity that excludes aspects of our full nature. When we try to be only the light and reject the shadow, both the light and the shadow become problematic. When we try to be only masculine or only feminine, both energies become distorted. When we identify completely with the ego and reject the wisdom of the unconscious, both conscious and unconscious forces become unbalanced. But when we recognize ourselves as the spacious awareness that can contain all opposites, integration becomes not only possible, but natural. We discover that consciousness itself has an innate tendency toward wholeness, that the psyche naturally moves toward balance when we stop interfering with its organic wisdom. This is why Jung emphasized that the goal of psychological development is not to transcend the human condition, but to embrace it fully from a place of expanded awareness. We don't seek to eliminate the archetypal energies, but to develop a conscious relationship with them. We don't try to perfect the ego, but to right-size it, recognizing it as an important function within the larger economy of consciousness rather than the totality of who we are. From this architectural understanding of the psyche, we can begin to navigate our inner world with the skill of a master builder. We learn to recognize which archetypal energies are active in any given moment, to honor their wisdom while not being overwhelmed by their power. We develop what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold creative tension between opposing forces until new possibilities emerge. Most importantly, we begin to live from the self rather than from any particular archetypal configuration. We make decisions not from ego need or shadow compulsion or persona pressure, but from the deep wisdom that emerges when all aspects of our nature are honored and integrated. We respond to life's challenges not from fragmented reactivity, but from integrated wholeness. This shift in identity, from the various archetypal contents to the consciousness that contains them all, is the foundation of true invulnerability. When we know ourselves as the awareness that can witness and integrate all psychological weather, we become immune to the suffering that comes from psychological identification and fragmentation. The architecture of the psyche, then, is not merely an abstract map, but a practical guide for living with unprecedented freedom and wholeness. It shows us how to navigate the complex terrain of human consciousness without being overwhelmed by its complexity. It reveals that what we thought were problems to be solved are actually aspects of our nature to be embraced and integrated. In understanding this inner architecture, we prepare ourselves for the deeper work of integration that lies ahead. For now that we have mapped the territory, we can begin the sacred work of befriending each archetypal inhabitant of our inner kingdom, starting with perhaps the most challenging and potentially transformative of all, the shadow that awaits our courageous embrace in the hidden chambers of consciousness. In the deepest vaults of the soul, where light has never penetrated and where we have buried our most feared aspects, dwells a figure that holds the keys to our ultimate liberation. This is our shadow, not merely the darkness we have rejected, but the very energy that has been severed from our conscious identity and exiled to the underworld of the psyche. Jung discovered what alchemists and mystics have known throughout the ages, that this dark twin, this forbidden other, is not our enemy but our greatest teacher, the guardian of treasures we never knew we possessed. You have felt its presence in those moments when you surprise yourself with an unexpected reaction, when words emerge from your mouth that seem to come from someone else, when you find yourself inexplicably drawn to or repelled by certain people or situations. You have glimpsed it in your dreams, where you encounter strangers who somehow feel familiar, figures who embody qualities you consciously disavow but secretly recognize as your own. The shadow is the part of you that you have spent your entire life running from, not realizing that in running, you have been running from the very source of your unlived power. This is perhaps the most radical and transformative insight in all of Jung's psychology, that what we resist in ourselves becomes the source of our external suffering, and what we integrate becomes the foundation of our authentic strength. The shadow is not simply our dark side, as popular psychology often suggests. It is the repository of all the vital energy, creativity, passion, and power that we have been forced to disown in order to maintain our socially acceptable persona. The formation of the shadow begins in the earliest moments of our lives, when we learn which aspects of our nature receive love and approval, and which meet with rejection or punishment. The human child, in its desperate need for connection and survival, quickly learns to suppress any aspect of its authentic nature that threatens its bond with its caregivers. What begins as a survival strategy becomes a lifelong pattern of self-betrayal as we continue to exile parts of ourselves long after the original threat has passed. But the shadow is far more complex than simple repression. It contains not only what we have consciously rejected, but also what we have never had the opportunity to develop. The introvert carries an extroverted shadow. The intellectual carries an instinctual shadow. The people pleaser carries an authentically powerful shadow. The rebel carries a shadow that yearns for belonging and structure. The shadow is our unlived life, our road not taken, our dormant potential waiting to be awakened. This is why shadow work is not about becoming a darker or more destructive person. It is about reclaiming the vital energy that has been locked away in the unconscious, integrating disowned aspects of our nature in ways that serve rather than sabotage our authentic expression. When we courageously turn to face our shadow, we often discover that what we feared was our capacity for evil is actually our capacity for authentic power, fierce love, creative expression, or passionate engagement with life. Consider the person who has built their identity around being nice, who prides themselves on never causing conflict or making waves. Their shadow likely contains their capacity for healthy anger, their ability to set boundaries, their willingness to fight for what they believe in. This shadow anger is not pathological. It is the natural response to injustice and boundary violations. When it remains unconscious, it may leak out in passive-aggressive behavior, depression, or inexplicable resentment toward others. But when it is consciously integrated, it becomes the fierce compassion of the warrior healer, the protective love of the wise parent, the righteous anger that fuels social transformation. Or consider the person who has built their identity around being rational and controlled, who prides themselves on never being emotional or irrational. Their shadow likely contains their capacity for spontaneity, creativity, intuitive wisdom, and passionate engagement. When this emotional shadow remains unconscious, it may erupt in inappropriate ways or be projected onto others who are seen as too emotional. But when consciously integrated, it becomes the source of artistic inspiration, empathic connection, and the kind of passionate commitment that fuels meaningful achievement. The shadow carries not only our disowned capacities, but also our disowned wounds. Often the aspects of others that trigger our strongest reactions are reminding us of our own unhealed pain. The person who cannot tolerate weakness in others may be carrying a shadow wound around their own vulnerability. The person who judges others for being selfish may be carrying a shadow wound around their own unmet needs. The shadow work here involves not just accepting these vulnerable aspects of ourselves, but offering them the compassion and healing they have long been denied. Jung understood that the shadow is autonomous. It has its own agenda and intelligence, and it will find ways to express itself whether we cooperate or not. When we refuse to acknowledge our shadow consciously, it begins to operate unconsciously, influencing our behavior in ways we don't recognize. It appears in our projections onto others, turning our relationships into battlegrounds where we fight external enemies who are actually mirrors of our internal conflicts. This is perhaps the most insidious form of shadow contamination, projection. When we cannot acknowledge certain qualities in ourselves, we begin to see them everywhere in the external world. The person who has exiled their own greed becomes hypersensitive to greed in others. The person who has disowned their own neediness becomes intolerant of dependency in their relationships. The person who has rejected their own capacity for cruelty becomes obsessed with the cruelty they perceive in the world around them. These projections create a form of psychological hell, where we find ourselves surrounded by exactly the qualities we most despise, never recognizing that we are looking into a funhouse mirror of our own disowned nature. We become trapped in repetitive patterns of conflict and judgment, unconsciously recreating the same dramas over and over again because we refuse to take responsibility for the shadow content that is actually driving these patterns. But projection also offers us the key to liberation. Jung taught that we can recognize our shadow through our projections. Whatever we judge most harshly in others is often a reflection of what we have judged most harshly in ourselves. This is not to say that all judgment is projection, or that harmful behavior should be excused. Rather, it suggests that the emotional charge we feel in response to certain behaviors often reveals something about our own unintegrated shadow material. The practice of withdrawing projections, recognizing the ways we have made others carry our shadow content, is one of the most powerful forms of shadow work. When we stop expecting others to embody our disowned darkness or light, we create space for authentic relationship. When we take responsibility for our own shadow material, we stop being unconscious agents of psychological contamination in our relationships and communities. This withdrawal of projections often requires us to embrace what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold the tension between our conscious self-image and our shadow reality until a larger truth emerges. It requires the humility to admit that we contain the very qualities we have spent our lives condemning in others, and the wisdom to find constructive ways to integrate these qualities rather than simply acting them out unconsciously. The integration of the shadow is not a one-time event, but an ongoing process that deepens throughout our lives. Each new life phase, each major transition, each expansion of our consciousness brings new shadow material to light. What we integrate at one level of development becomes the foundation for encountering deeper layers of disowned content. The shadow work is never finished, but it becomes increasingly familiar and less frightening as we develop trust in our capacity to integrate whatever arises. One of the most profound aspects of shadow work is the discovery of what Jung called the golden shadow, the positive qualities we have disowned because they were deemed too dangerous, too threatening, or too bright for our family or social environment. Many people, particularly those raised in environments that discouraged excellence or self-expression, carry a golden shadow containing their natural confidence, creativity, leadership abilities, or spiritual gifts. The golden shadow can be more challenging to integrate than the dark shadow because claiming our disowned magnificence often requires us to disappoint others' expectations, to step beyond the limitations that have kept us feeling safe and accepted. It requires us to risk the envy or rejection of those who have invested in our remaining small. But until we reclaim our golden shadow, we cannot access our full creative and spiritual potential. The process of shadow integration transforms our relationship to power itself. When we have made unconscious what we fear about our own capacity for destruction or creation, we become either powerless victims who give their power away to others or unconscious perpetrators who wield power in destructive ways. But when we consciously acknowledge and integrate our shadow, we develop what might be called sacred power, the capacity to influence reality in ways that serve the highest good of all concerned. This sacred power emerges from wholeness rather than fragmentation, from integration rather than denial. It is not the power over others that comes from projecting our shadow onto them and then fighting the external enemy. It is the power that comes from taking full responsibility for our own psychological content and learning to channel all aspects of our nature in service of our deepest values and most authentic expression. Shadow work also transforms our relationship to creativity and innovation. The shadow often contains our most original and creative impulses, the thoughts, feelings, and expressions that were deemed too unconventional or threatening to express. When we reclaim these shadow aspects, we often discover wellsprings of creative energy that have been blocked for years or decades. The artist finds their authentic voice. The entrepreneur discovers their innovative vision. The healer accesses their intuitive gifts. This creative reclaiming often requires us to disappoint our internalized critics, to risk creating something that others might not understand or approve of. It requires us to trust the wisdom of our shadow impulses, to recognize that what we have labeled as wrong or inappropriate may actually be our most authentic and valuable contribution to the world. The shadow also holds keys to our deepest intimacy and connection with others. When we have disowned aspects of our own humanity, we cannot truly meet others in theirs. We remain defended against the very qualities in others that mirror our own disowned nature. But when we have embraced our own shadow, our own capacity for selfishness and generosity, cruelty and compassion, weakness and strength, we can meet others with the deep acceptance that comes from self-acceptance. This transformation of our capacity for relationship is one of the most beautiful fruits of shadow work. We stop needing others to be different than they are in order for us to be comfortable with ourselves. We stop trying to fix, change, or improve others, and instead meet them with the spacious presence that allows them to be exactly who they are in this moment. This acceptance does not mean condoning harmful behavior, but it means responding to difficulty from a place of integrated wholeness rather than reactive fragmentation. Perhaps most importantly, shadow work reveals the profound truth that there is no aspect of human nature that cannot be transformed through conscious integration. The very qualities that seem most destructive often contain, in their essence, vital energies that can be channeled toward creative and healing purposes. Anger becomes fierce compassion. Greed becomes passionate engagement. Pride becomes healthy self-respect. Even what seems most pathological often reveals itself, when consciously engaged, as life energy that has been distorted by unconsciousness, but can be reclaimed through awareness and integration. This is the ultimate gift of the shadow, the recognition that consciousness itself is alchemical. Whatever we bring into conscious awareness can be transformed through that awareness. We do not need to eliminate difficult aspects of our nature, nor do we need to act them out destructively. We can provide them with the light of consciousness and discover how they want to serve our wholeness and authentic expression. From the perspective of the indestructible awareness we explored in earlier chapters, the shadow reveals itself as yet another temporary formation within the field of consciousness. Like all psychological content, it arises and passes away within the unchanging awareness that we truly are. But unlike other psychological formations, the shadow carries special medicine because it represents the energy we have most feared to acknowledge and integrate. When we recognize ourselves as the consciousness that can contain and transform even our shadow material, we become truly invulnerable to psychological suffering. We are no longer at the mercy of our own disowned aspects, no longer projecting our internal conflicts onto external circumstances, no longer fighting enemies that exist primarily in the mirror of our own unconsciousness. Instead, we become agents of integration and wholeness, capable of meeting whatever arises in ourselves and others with the transformative power of conscious acceptance. We become what Jung called individuated beings, not perfect people but whole people, who have learned to dance with all aspects of human nature from a place of centered awareness. The shadow, then, is not something to be conquered or eliminated, but something to be courageously embraced as the guardian of our most authentic power. In befriending our dark twin, we reclaim the energy we have spent our lives fighting against and discover that our greatest enemy was actually our most treasured ally, waiting patiently in the darkness for us to find the courage to extend the hand of conscious friendship. This embrace of the shadow prepares us for the even deeper work of individuation that lies ahead, the recognition that all psychological content, both light and dark, exists within the infinite space of awareness that is our true nature. From this foundation of integrated wholeness, we can begin to explore how consciousness itself serves as the alchemical vessel in which all aspects of human experience are transformed into wisdom, compassion, and authentic power. Listen now to the story of the mask, that familiar friend and secret jailer that each of us carries, polished to perfection through years of careful craftsmanship. You know this mask well, for you have worn it so long that its weight has become the weight of your very identity. It is the face you show the world, the carefully constructed image that promises safety in a realm where authenticity feels too dangerous to risk. The persona, as Jung called it, emerges from our earliest encounters with the world's expectations. Like a young actor learning their first role, the child within you quickly discovered which expressions earned approval, which gestures secured love, which words opened doors, and which ones slammed them shut. And so began the great work of construction, layer upon layer of acceptable responses, appropriate emotions, and socially sanctioned ways of being. But here lies the first great paradox of the human condition. The very mask we create to protect us becomes our prison. The persona that promises safety delivers instead a subtle form of bondage, for we become so identified with our role that we forget the one who plays it. We mistake the costume for the actor, the character for the soul that breathes life into it. Consider the businessman who has worn the mask of success so long that he no longer knows who he is without the suit, the title, the corner office. His sense of worth has become so entangled with external validation that every market downturn threatens not just his portfolio, but his very existence. The mask that once protected his tender heart from the world's judgments has become a cage that imprisons his authentic self. Or witness the perfectionist who has crafted an image of flawless competence, never allowing others to glimpse the vulnerable human being beneath. Every mistake becomes a crisis of identity, every criticism a potential shattering of the carefully maintained facade. The energy required to maintain this image is exhausting, leaving little vitality for the spontaneous expression of genuine feeling or authentic desire. The woman who has built her identity around being needed, always available, always helpful, finds herself depleted and resentful, yet terrified to stop giving lest she discover that without her usefulness she has no value. The rebel who defines himself in opposition to authority discovers that his very rebellion has become another form of conformity, another mask that limits his freedom to simply be. These are not failures of character but natural consequences of living in a world that seems to demand performance over presence, image over authenticity. The tragedy is not that we create personas, this is a necessary part of psychological development, but that we become so identified with them that we forget they are constructions, tools to be used rather than truths to be defended. Jung understood that the persona serves a vital function in the early stages of psychological development. Like training wheels on a bicycle, it provides stability as we learn to navigate the complex demands of social existence. But what serves us in youth can become our limitation in maturity. The mask that once protected our emerging sense of self can eventually suffocate the very life it was meant to preserve. The first crack in the persona's prison often comes through what feels like failure or loss. The successful executive faces bankruptcy. The perfect mother watches her child struggle with addiction. The helpful friend discovers that her constant giving has created dependency rather than genuine connection. These moments of breakdown are actually invitations to break through, opportunities to discover what remains when the mask falls away. But the ego resists this dissolution with every fiber of its being. It has invested so much energy in maintaining the persona that any threat to its integrity feels like a threat to existence itself. The ego whispers urgently, "Without this image, who will love you? Without this role, what value do you have? Without this mask, how will you survive in a world that demands performance?" These whispers reveal the ego's fundamental misunderstanding of its own nature. The ego believes it is the mask, that persona and true self are identical. It cannot conceive of existence without the protective shell it has so carefully constructed. This is why the dissolution of persona often feels like a kind of death, because from the ego's perspective, it is exactly that. Yet this death is precisely what opens the door to rebirth. When we have the courage to remove the mask, even briefly, we discover something remarkable. We do not disappear. Beneath the carefully crafted image lies something far more substantial than we ever dared imagine, an essential self that needs no external validation because it draws its life from an inexhaustible inner source. This essential self is not another persona, not another role to be played or image to be maintained. It is the consciousness that observes all roles, the awareness that witnesses all masks without being limited by any of them. It is what remains when everything that can be taken away has been stripped clean, and it is invulnerable precisely because it cannot be touched by external circumstances. The journey from persona to authentic self is not a single dramatic revelation, but a gradual process of differentiation. It requires learning to distinguish between who we are and what we do, between our essential nature and our social functions. This differentiation begins with the simple recognition that we are not our roles, not our achievements, not our relationships, not even our thoughts and feelings. Watch a skilled actor switching between characters, and you glimpse this differentiation in action. The actor knows they are not Hamlet or Lady Macbeth, even as they embody these roles completely. They can inhabit the character fully without losing themselves in the performance. This is the freedom that comes from conscious relationship with persona, the ability to use the mask without being used by it. But how do we begin this process of liberation? How do we loosen the chains of identification that have bound us for so long? The path begins with the cultivation of witness consciousness, the practice of observing our own performances with compassionate detachment. Instead of being completely absorbed in the role, we learn to maintain dual awareness, participating fully while simultaneously recognizing the theatrical nature of our participation. This witness consciousness allows us to see how we automatically slip into different personas depending on our circumstances. Notice how you become different versions of yourself with your family, your colleagues, your friends. None of these versions is false, but neither is any single one the complete truth of who you are. You are the consciousness that can inhabit all these roles while being limited by none of them. The practice of witnessing reveals something profound. The personas we've created are not arbitrary constructions, but expressions of genuine aspects of our nature. The businessman's drive for achievement reflects a legitimate desire for creativity and impact. The helper's urge to serve others springs from authentic compassion. The perfectionist's attention to detail emerges from a genuine appreciation for excellence. The problem is not the qualities themselves, but our identification with them. When we believe we are only the achiever, only the helper, only the perfectionist, we cut ourselves off from the full spectrum of our humanity. We become like musicians who know only one song, no matter how beautifully they play it. True freedom comes not from destroying the persona, but from expanding our repertoire, recognizing that we are the entire orchestra, not just the first violin. We can play the achiever when achievement is called for, the helper when service is needed, the perfectionist when precision is required. But we are not imprisoned by any of these roles, because we know ourselves as the player who can choose which instrument to take up. This expanded identity brings with it a profound shift in our relationship to criticism and approval. When we know ourselves as larger than any single role, criticism of our performance no longer threatens our core identity. A bad review becomes information about the effectiveness of a particular approach rather than a judgment on our fundamental worth. Similarly, praise and approval, while pleasant, no longer carry the desperate importance they once held. We can receive acknowledgement graciously without becoming addicted to it, because our sense of self no longer depends on external validation. We know who we are independent of others' opinions, not through arrogance, but through direct experience of our essential nature. This liberation from the tyranny of others' opinions is one of the first fruits of authentic invulnerability. When our identity is not contingent on external approval, we become immune to the manipulation that depends on our need to be liked, admired, or accepted. We can speak truth without calculating its reception, act from integrity without weighing its popularity, make choices based on inner knowing rather than social pressure. But perhaps the most profound gift of liberating ourselves from persona identification is the recovery of spontaneity. When we are not constantly managing our image, enormous amounts of energy are freed for creative expression. Like a river released from its dam, our authentic nature begins to flow with renewed vitality and surprising directions. This spontaneity brings with it a quality of freshness that transforms our relationships. Others can sense when we are performing versus when we are simply being present. The difference is magnetic. Authenticity draws people toward us not because of what we're trying to project, but because of what we're not trying to hide. When we stop performing our worth, others can finally perceive our value. Yet this journey toward authenticity requires great courage, for it means relinquishing the illusion of control that the persona provides. When we stop managing our image, we can no longer predict exactly how others will respond to us. This uncertainty can feel terrifying to the ego, which prefers the security of known reactions, even if they are limiting. The courage to be authentic in a world that often rewards performance is perhaps the most radical act available to us. It requires faith, not necessarily in any particular doctrine or deity, but in the fundamental goodness of our essential nature. It requires trusting that what we truly are is worthy of love and respect, even when we cannot prove this through external achievements or carefully managed impressions. This trust is not naive optimism, but hard-won wisdom. It emerges from the direct experience of our indestructible core, that consciousness within us that remains untouched by life's changing circumstances. When we know ourselves as this unchanging awareness, we discover that we need no protection because there is nothing in us that can be damaged by external events. Consider the difference between a soap bubble and a drop of mercury. The soap bubble is beautiful but fragile. One touch can destroy it completely. The drop of mercury, by contrast, can be divided into countless smaller drops, yet each retains the essential nature of the whole. No external force can change what mercury is, only its temporary form. The ego, identified with its personas, is like the soap bubble, exquisite but vulnerable to the slightest disturbance. The essential self is like mercury, adaptable to any container while never losing its fundamental nature. When we know ourselves as this essential self, we discover a form of invulnerability that requires no armor because it needs no protection. This shift from bubble consciousness to mercury consciousness transforms our entire relationship to existence. We can engage fully with life's experiences without being defined by them. We can love deeply without becoming dependent on being loved in return. We can strive for excellence without being devastated by failure. We can care about outcomes without being attached to them. This paradox, caring without attachment, is central to Jung's understanding of individuation. It is not the detachment of withdrawal, but the engagement of freedom. Like an artist completely absorbed in creating while remaining unattached to critics' reviews, we learn to pour ourselves fully into life while maintaining our essential independence. The dissolution of persona identification also opens us to what Jung called the transcendent function, the bridge between conscious and unconscious that allows for genuine psychological integration. When we are not defending a fixed image of ourselves, we become curious about the aspects of our nature that don't fit our personas. Instead of rejecting these shadow elements, we can explore them with interest and compassion. This integration of previously rejected aspects of ourselves is not about indulging every impulse, but about acknowledging the full spectrum of our humanity. The perfectionist learns to accept their mistakes. The rebel discovers their desire for belonging. The helper recognizes their own need to receive. These integrations don't eliminate our primary orientations, but expand them into more complete expressions of our nature. As this integration progresses, we discover that authenticity is not about having no masks, but about choosing our masks consciously. We maintain our professional demeanor in business settings, not from compulsion, but from wisdom. We express different aspects of ourselves in different relationships, not from fragmentation, but from the abundance of our multifaceted nature. This conscious relationship with persona allows us to be truly helpful to others in their own journeys toward authenticity. Instead of modeling perfect performance, we can demonstrate the courage of imperfection. Instead of projecting invulnerability, we can embody the strength that comes from accepting vulnerability. Instead of hiding our struggles, we can show others that growth happens not despite our difficulties, but through our honest engagement with them. The liberation from persona identification ultimately reveals itself as a gift not only to ourselves, but to the entire human family. When one person has the courage to stop performing and start being, it gives others permission to do the same. Authenticity is contagious, not because we preach it, but because we embody it. In this way, the journey from mask to authenticity becomes a form of service to the collective unconscious. Each individual who breaks free from the prison of persona weakens that prison for everyone. Each person who discovers their essential invulnerability makes it easier for others to find their own. The path is neither quick nor easy, for the habits of persona identification run deep and are reinforced by countless social pressures. But it is always available, requiring only the willingness to question who we think we are and the courage to discover who we actually might be when all pretense falls away. This questioning need not be dramatic or sudden. It can begin with simple moments of honesty, admitting when we don't know something instead of pretending expertise, expressing genuine feeling instead of appropriate responses, making choices based on inner knowing rather than external expectations. These small acts of authenticity are like drops of water that eventually wear away the hardest stone. As we practice this gentle dissolution of false identification, we begin to recognize the signs of genuine authenticity in others. We develop the ability to sense when someone is performing versus when they are simply present. This discernment protects us from being manipulated by others' personas while drawing us toward those rare souls who have found the courage to be real. The ultimate paradox of the persona's prison is that it promises safety but delivers vulnerability, while the authenticity we fear will make us vulnerable actually delivers safety of the deepest kind. When we know who we are independent of external validation, we become immune to the forms of psychological manipulation that depend on our insecurity and need for approval. This is the invulnerability that Jung pointed toward, not the brittle armor of the defended ego, but the fluid strength of consciousness that knows itself as larger than any role it plays. It is the security that comes not from controlling others' responses, but from being unshakable in our own center. It is the peace that emerges not from having no challenges, but from knowing that no challenge can touch what we essentially are. And so the journey continues, this gradual awakening from the dream of being only what we appear to be. Each moment offers a fresh opportunity to choose authenticity over performance, presence over persona, being over seeming. The prison door was never locked from the outside. It opens the moment we stop believing we need its protection and step into the vast freedom of our essential nature. Deep within the architecture of your psyche, an ancient dance unfolds, a timeless choreography between the masculine and feminine principles that Jung recognized as the Anima and animus. This is not merely about gender as society constructs it, but about the fundamental polarities of consciousness itself. The receptive and the assertive, the intuitive and the rational, the feeling and the thinking, the lunar and the solar aspects of your complete being. Listen closely, and you may hear their whispered conversation echoing through the chambers of your inner world. She speaks in the language of dreams and symbols, in the poetry of emotion and the wisdom of the heart. He responds in the clarity of focused intention, in the strength of decisive action, and the architecture of logical thought. Together they compose the full symphony of human consciousness, yet how often we mistake their dialogue for discord, their dance for division. The tragedy of the modern psyche lies not in the absence of these inner figures, but in our projection of them onto the external world. Like ancient peoples who worshiped the sun and moon as separate deities, forgetting they were aspects of one cosmic dance, we split our wholeness in two and spend our lives searching for completion in another person. We become beggars at the feast of love, not recognizing that we carry within ourselves the very nourishment we seek. Consider the man who has never met his inner feminine. His anima remains unconscious, buried beneath layers of cultural conditioning that taught him to equate masculinity with emotional suppression. He moves through the world with competence and determination, yet feels perpetually empty, as though some essential part of himself were missing. In relationships, he unconsciously seeks a woman to carry his rejected femininity, to provide the emotional warmth and intuitive wisdom he has disowned within himself. But what he does not understand is that no external person can ever fulfill this role completely. The woman he loves becomes a screen onto which he projects his own inner feminine, and when she inevitably fails to match his unconscious expectations, when she reveals herself to be human rather than goddess, disappointment and resentment arise. He blames her for not being the completion he sought, never recognizing that what he truly longed for was reunion with his own disowned nature. Similarly, observe the woman who has never acknowledged her inner masculine. Her animus remains in shadow, expressing itself through unconscious possession, rather than conscious integration. She may find herself dominated by critical inner voices, by sudden eruptions of irrational judgment, by a harshness toward herself and others that she cannot understand or control. In relationships, she seeks a man to embody the focused power and decisive clarity she has never claimed as her own. Yet this external search for completion can never satisfy the soul's deeper longing. The man she chooses becomes a repository for her projected animus, and when he fails to be the perfect embodiment of strength and wisdom, when he reveals his own vulnerabilities and limitations, she may respond with the very criticism and judgment that signal her animus operating in shadow. The sacred masculine she seeks cannot be found in another person because it exists within her own psyche, waiting to be recognized and integrated. These projections create what Jung called the participation mystique, a psychological fusion where we lose the boundaries between self and other, becoming entangled in each other's unconscious contents. Like lovers who mistake symbiosis for intimacy, we bind ourselves to relationships that promise completion but deliver instead a subtle form of slavery. We become vulnerable to every fluctuation in the other's mood, every change in their availability, every moment when they fail to confirm our projected expectations. But there exists another way, a path toward the hieros gamos, the sacred marriage that occurs not between two separate people, but within the unified field of individual consciousness. This is the wedding of masculine and feminine principles within your own psyche, the recognition that you are already complete, already whole, already containing both the bride and groom of your own. Becoming the journey toward this inner marriage begins with the courageous recognition of these inner figures as autonomous aspects of your own consciousness. Instead of unconsciously projecting them onto others, you learn to establish a conscious relationship with your anima or animus, to hear their voices not as external demands but as inner guidance, to honor their wisdom not through another person but through direct engagement with your own depths. For the man, this means developing the capacity to receive as well as to give, to feel as well as to think, to allow as well as to act. It means recognizing that strength includes tenderness, that power encompasses vulnerability, that true masculinity is large enough to embrace the full spectrum of human emotion. As he learns to honor his inner feminine, he discovers that she is not weakness but wisdom, not softness but sensitivity, not passivity but the profound receptivity that allows life to flow through him. Watch how this integration transforms his relationships. No longer seeking a woman to complete him, he can appreciate the women in his life for who they actually are rather than who he needs them to be. His love becomes an offering rather than a demand, a celebration rather than a dependency. He can be present to feminine beauty without being possessed by it, can appreciate feminine wisdom without abdicating his own authority. For the woman, the journey involves reclaiming her inner masculine, not by becoming harsh or aggressive, but by developing the capacity for focused intention, clear boundaries, and decisive action. It means recognizing that she can be both receptive and directive, both nurturing and powerful, both flowing and structured. As she integrates her animus, she discovers that he is not aggression but assertion, not domination but discrimination, not rigidity but the focused clarity that allows her to manifest her deepest values in the world. This integration liberates her from the unconscious criticism and judgment that arise when the animus operates in shadow. Instead of being possessed by inner voices that tear down her confidence, she learns to access the discriminating wisdom that helps her distinguish between what serves her growth and what diminishes her vitality. She becomes her own authority, her own protector, her own advocate. Watch how this changes her relationships with men. No longer seeking external validation or protection, she can engage with masculine energy as an equal, rather than as a supplicant. Her love becomes a choice rather than a need, a conscious creation rather than an unconscious compulsion. She can appreciate masculine strength without losing her own power, can receive masculine support without sacrificing her autonomy. The sacred marriage within is not a one-time event, but an ongoing process of integration, a continuous dialogue between the masculine and feminine aspects of consciousness. It requires learning to honor both voices without being dominated by either, to access both energies without losing yourself in their expression. Like a skilled conductor leading an orchestra, you learn to orchestrate the interplay between these inner forces in service of your highest expression. This process often begins through what Jung called active imagination, consciously engaging with these inner figures through dialogue, visualization, or creative expression. You might imagine conversations with your anima or animus, asking for their guidance and wisdom. You might express their energies through art, dance, or writing. You might simply practice recognizing their influence in your daily life, noticing when you are operating from masculine focus or feminine receptivity. As this conscious relationship develops, you begin to experience what it means to be psychologically androgynous, not confused about your gender identity, but complete in your human expression. You can access fierce protectiveness when your boundaries are threatened, and gentle compassion when healing is needed. You can think with laser-sharp clarity and feel with oceanic depth. You can act with decisive power and receive with gracious openness. This wholeness within transforms your relationship to vulnerability. When you are no longer seeking completion in another person, you can afford to be vulnerable in love without losing yourself. You can open your heart fully while maintaining your center, can share your depths without drowning in another's needs. Vulnerability becomes a gift rather than a desperate offering. Intimacy becomes a choice rather than a compulsion. The paradox is that as you become complete within yourself, you actually become more available for genuine relationship with others. When you are not using relationships to fill an inner void, you can engage with others from abundance rather than scarcity. Your love becomes pure gift, untainted by hidden agendas or unconscious projections. This shift from dependency to interdependence marks the difference between immature and mature love. Immature love says, "I love you because I need you." Mature love says, "I need you because I love you," not from emptiness, but from the overflow of an already full heart. This mature love is invulnerable, not because it doesn't care deeply, but because it doesn't need the other person to be anything other than who they are. The sacred marriage within also awakens what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold opposites in creative tension without collapsing into either extreme. You learn to be both strong and gentle, both independent and connected, both grounded and flowing. This psychological flexibility makes you unshakable because you cannot be trapped in any single mode of being. Consider how this inner wholeness affects your response to relationship challenges. When someone you love is unavailable, you do not collapse into abandonment because you remain present to yourself. When someone criticizes you, you do not defend desperately because your worth is not dependent on their approval. When someone leaves, you do not fragment because you were never incomplete to begin with. This does not mean you become cold or detached. Rather, you become like a mountain, capable of holding both the storm and the sunshine without being fundamentally altered by either. You can feel deeply without being destabilized, can love fully without losing yourself, can grieve completely without being destroyed. The integration of anima and animus also awakens a profound creativity, for it is in the marriage of masculine and feminine principles that all creation is born. The masculine provides the focused intention, the seed of possibility. The feminine provides the receptive nurturing, the fertile ground of manifestation. When these energies work together within your own consciousness, you become a co-creator with life itself. This creative capacity extends far beyond artistic expression, though it may manifest there as well. It is the creativity of conscious living, the artistry of authentic being, the poetry of presence itself. You begin to create your life as a work of art, bringing both vision and flow, both structure and spontaneity, to the canvas of your existence. The journey toward inner marriage also reveals the deeper meaning of romantic attraction. Often we are drawn to people who embody the qualities of our unconscious anima or animus, not because we should merge with them, but because they mirror back to us aspects of our own nature that we need to integrate. The intense attraction we feel towards certain individuals is actually the soul's recognition of its own disowned qualities reflected in another. Understanding this dynamic transforms the way we navigate romantic relationships. Instead of seeking fusion with the beloved, we can use the relationship as a mirror for our own psychological development. Instead of losing ourselves in projection, we can reclaim the energies we have placed onto our partner. The relationship becomes a vehicle for individuation rather than an escape from it. This shift requires enormous courage, for it means taking responsibility for our own completion rather than expecting another person to provide it. It means facing the loneliness of being an individual, even within relationship, accepting that no one can fully understand or fulfill us because completion is an inside job. Yet this responsibility brings with it the most profound form of freedom, liberation from the endless cycle of seeking, finding, and losing that characterizes unconscious romantic patterns. When you know yourself as already whole, you can choose relationships based on joy rather than need, on expansion rather than completion, on celebration rather than salvation. The sacred marriage within also heals the ancient wound between spirit and matter, heaven and earth, transcendence and immanence. In many traditions, the masculine principle has been associated with the drive toward transcendence, the urge to rise above earthly concerns and merge with the absolute. The feminine principle has been linked with immanence, the recognition of the sacred within the material world, the celebration of embodied existence. When these principles are integrated within consciousness, we discover that transcendence and immanence are not opposing forces but complementary aspects of one reality. We can reach toward the infinite while remaining rooted in the present moment, can touch the eternal while fully embracing the temporal. This integration heals the split between spiritual seeking and worldly engagement that has wounded so many seekers. The inner marriage reveals that enlightenment is not an escape from human experience, but its fullest flowering. You do not need to choose between being human and being divine. You are the place where humanity and divinity meet, the bridge between earth and heaven, the conscious marriage of matter and spirit. This realization brings a profound peace that no external relationship can threaten. When you know yourself as the union of opposites, as the place where all polarities resolve, you become unshakable. You are no longer vulnerable to the fluctuations of external love because you rest in the unchanging love that is your own essential nature. The journey continues to unfold as you learn to embody this sacred marriage in your daily life. Each moment offers an opportunity to choose wholeness over fragmentation, integration over projection, conscious love over unconscious need. The anima and animus within you continue their eternal dance, and you become both the dancers and the dance, both the lovers and the love that unites them. In this recognition, you discover the secret that mystics have known throughout history, that what you seek, you already are. The beloved you long for dwells within your own heart. The completion you crave already exists in the depths of your being. The sacred marriage you dream of is not an event to be achieved, but a reality to be recognized. Not a destination to reach, but a truth to remember. And in this remembering, you find yourself invulnerable at last, not because you have built walls against love, but because you have discovered that you are love itself, wearing the temporary costumes of form, playing the eternal game of hide and seek with your own infinite nature. The search is over because the seeker and the sought were never separate. The marriage is complete because the bride and groom were always one. The dance continues because it is the very movement of consciousness itself, celebrating its own inexhaustible creativity through the divine play of relationship within the unified field of being. Beneath the familiar territory of your personal memories and individual experiences lies a realm so vast and profound that the mind can barely comprehend its dimensions. Jung called it the collective unconscious, that primordial ocean of shared human experience from which all individual consciousness emerges like waves upon an infinite sea. To recognize yourself as both wave and ocean, both droplet and entirety, is to discover a form of invulnerability that transcends all personal fears and anxieties. Imagine for a moment that you have lived your entire life believing yourself to be a single wave upon the ocean's surface. You identify completely with your particular form, your height, your shape, the direction of your movement. You fear other waves that seem larger or more powerful, worry about the rocks that might break you apart, dread the inevitable moment when you will crash upon the shore and disappear forever. This is the predicament of ego consciousness, trapped in the illusion of separateness. The personal ego experiences itself as isolated, vulnerable, finite, a temporary formation that emerged from nothing and will return to nothing. From this perspective, life becomes a desperate struggle to maintain form, to avoid dissolution, to preserve the fragile boundaries that seem to define individual existence. But what if you were to suddenly remember that you are not merely the wave, but the ocean itself, temporarily expressing through this particular formation? What if you realized that your essence is not the temporary shape you inhabit, but the infinite water that takes countless forms while never losing its essential nature? In that moment of recognition, fear dissolves, not because the wave becomes permanent, but because you understand that what you truly are was never threatened by the wave's transformation. This is the revelation that Jung uncovered in his exploration of the collective unconscious, the recognition that individual consciousness is not separate from, but expressions of universal consciousness itself. We are not isolated beings struggling alone in an indifferent universe, but manifestations of the same creative source, experiencing itself through infinite perspectives. The collective unconscious reveals itself through the archetypal patterns that emerge across all cultures and throughout all history. The great mother who appears in countless mythologies, the wise old man who guides heroes on their journeys, the trickster who disrupts established order, the hero who faces impossible challenges. These are not arbitrary creations of individual imagination, but expressions of universal patterns that live within the depths of every human psyche. When you begin to recognize these archetypal energies operating within your own experience, something profound shifts in your relationship to existence. The challenges you face are no longer merely personal struggles, but participation in universal themes that have played out countless times throughout human history. Your suffering connects you to the great ocean of human suffering. Your joy participates in the eternal celebration of life itself. Consider the young person facing the archetypal journey of leaving home, venturing into the unknown, and discovering their place in the world. From the ego's perspective, this transition feels uniquely personal, fraught with individual fears and anxieties. But when recognized as participation in the hero's journey, an archetypal pattern that has guided human development since consciousness first emerged, the personal struggle becomes universal adventure. The same fears that once felt isolating now connect the young person to every hero who has ever faced the unknown. The same courage required for growth links them to an infinite lineage of those who chose transformation over stagnation. They are no longer alone in their becoming, but supported by the collective wisdom of all who have walked this path before. This recognition transforms the nature of personal challenge. When you understand your struggles as archetypal experiences, they cease to be evidence of your individual inadequacy and become instead opportunities for participation in the larger patterns of human development. The depression that once felt like personal failure reveals itself as the necessary descent that precedes rebirth. The conflict that seemed like individual chaos shows itself as the creative tension that generates new forms of consciousness. The collective unconscious speaks to us most clearly through dreams, where the personal mind releases its grip and allows deeper currents to flow freely. In the landscape of sleep, we encounter figures and symbols that carry meanings far beyond our individual experience. The wise woman who appears to offer guidance, the dark figure who pursues us through shadowy corridors, the luminous child who points toward new possibilities. These dream visitors emerge from the collective depths to remind us of truths that transcend personal knowledge. But you need not wait for sleep to commune with these deeper layers of being. The collective unconscious reveals itself in the myths and stories that capture your imagination, in the art that moves you to tears, in the music that seems to speak directly to your soul. These responses are not merely personal preferences, but recognitions, moments when your individual consciousness touches the universal patterns that live within us all. When you read a fairy tale and find yourself stirred by the princess awakening from her enchanted sleep, you are not simply enjoying a story, but recognizing an archetypal pattern of consciousness emerging from unconsciousness. When you watch a film about the outlaw who challenges corrupt authority and feel your heart racing with excitement, you are participating in the eternal archetype of the revolutionary who disrupts stagnant systems to allow new life to emerge. These recognitions point toward a profound truth about the nature of individual existence. We are not separate beings having isolated experiences, but expressions of universal consciousness, exploring itself through countless unique perspectives. Your joys and sorrows, triumphs and failures, loves and losses are not merely personal events, but contributions to the ongoing story of consciousness knowing itself. This understanding transforms the fear of death that haunts so many individual lives. When you know yourself as wave and ocean simultaneously, the dissolution of your particular form becomes not extinction, but transformation. The wave that crashes upon the shore does not disappear. It returns to the ocean from which it emerged, its temporary individuality absorbed back into the infinite wholeness from which all forms arise. But this transformation is not something that happens only at physical death. It occurs in every moment when the boundaries of separate selfhood soften and you remember your participation in the larger whole. It happens in moments of deep love when the barriers between self and other dissolve into unity. It occurs in experiences of natural beauty when the perceiver and perceived merge into one seamless awareness. It unfolds in creative inspiration when individual effort gives way to the sense of being moved by forces larger than personal will. These glimpses of unity are not peak experiences separate from ordinary life, but invitations to recognize what has always been true, that the boundaries between self and world, individual and collective, finite and infinite, are constructions of thought rather than absolute realities. We are always swimming in the ocean of being, but most of the time we forget to notice the water. The cultivation of this remembrance is perhaps the most profound form of spiritual practice available to human consciousness. It requires learning to identify not with the temporary formations of personality and circumstance, but with the awareness that witnesses all formations while being limited by none. This awareness is not personal property, but the universal consciousness expressing through your particular nervous system. When you rest in this recognition, a profound peace descends, not the peace of problem solving, but the peace of problem transcendence. The anxieties that once seemed so urgent reveal themselves as temporary disturbances on the surface of an infinitely deep stillness. The fears that once drove desperate action are seen as misunderstandings about the nature of what you are. This does not mean becoming passive or indifferent to life's challenges. Rather, it means engaging with difficulties from a fundamentally different starting point, not from the defensive crouch of a separate self trying to protect itself, but from the expansive awareness of consciousness exploring its own creative possibilities. Action arising from this recognition carries a different quality, less driven by fear, more guided by wisdom, less concerned with personal advantage, more aligned with the larger patterns of growth and evolution. The recognition of your participation in the collective unconscious also transforms your relationship to other people. When you understand that others are not separate beings with whom you must compete for limited resources, but expressions of the same consciousness wearing different masks, compassion arises naturally. Their struggles become recognizable as your own struggles seen from different angles. Their victories become causes for celebration because they are victories of the one consciousness that expresses through all forms. This shift in perception heals the fundamental loneliness that haunts individual existence. You are never truly alone because you are always connected to the infinite web of consciousness that manifests as all beings. The isolation you sometimes feel is not because you are actually separate, but because you have temporarily forgotten your essential connection to the whole. This forgetting and remembering is itself part of the larger pattern of consciousness, exploring its own nature. Like an actor who becomes so absorbed in a role that they temporarily forget they are acting, consciousness takes on the identity of separate beings in order to experience the drama of relationship, growth, and discovery. But just as the actor can remember their true identity while continuing to play the role, you can remember your essential nature while continuing to participate in the human adventure. The collective unconscious also reveals the futility of trying to protect yourself against life's inevitable changes. When you understand that you are the ocean temporarily wearing the costume of a wave, you realize that what seems like threat to the wave cannot touch what you essentially are. Loss becomes transformation. Death becomes rebirth. Ending becomes beginning. This recognition makes you invulnerable in the most profound sense, not because nothing can happen to your personal circumstances, but because what you truly are cannot be threatened by any circumstance. You can love without fear of loss, because love is what you are rather than something you possess. You can create without attachment to results, because creativity is your nature rather than your achievement. You can engage fully with life while remaining unshakable, because engagement is the play of consciousness rather than the struggle of separation. The archetypal patterns that emerge from the collective unconscious also provide maps for navigating life's transitions. When you recognize the stage of the journey you are in, you can align with its natural rhythms rather than fighting against them. The time of wandering in the wilderness is understood as necessary preparation for the promised land. The dark night of the soul is recognized as the prelude to spiritual dawn. The death of old forms is welcomed as the clearing that allows new growth to emerge. This alignment with archetypal patterns brings a sense of rightness to existence, even in the midst of difficulty. You are no longer improvising blindly but participating consciously in patterns that have guided human development throughout the history. Your individual life becomes a unique variation on universal themes, a personal expression of eternal truths. The practice of recognizing archetypal patterns in daily life becomes a form of ongoing initiation. Each challenge becomes an opportunity to embody universal wisdom in personal form. Each relationship becomes a chance to explore the eternal dynamics of human connection. Each creative act becomes participation in the ongoing creation of the universe itself. As this recognition deepens, you begin to experience what mystics throughout history have called union, not the merger of separate things, but the recognition of what was never actually separate. You are not becoming one with the collective unconscious. You are remembering that you were never apart from it. The wave is not joining the ocean. The wave is recognizing its oceanic nature. This recognition transforms every aspect of human experience. Work becomes play, effort becomes flow, struggle becomes dance. You are no longer pushing against life, but moving with it. No longer trying to force outcomes, but trusting the intelligence that moves through all things. This is not passive resignation, but active participation in the creative unfolding of consciousness itself. The fears that once drove your actions, fear of rejection, fear of failure, fear of death, are revealed as misunderstandings about your fundamental nature. What can be rejected when you are the awareness in which all acceptance and rejection arise? What can fail when you are the consciousness that witnesses all success and failure? What can die when you are the life that animates all forms? These recognitions do not eliminate the human experiences of emotion and challenge, but they place them in a larger context. Pain is still painful, but it no longer threatens your essential well-being. Joy is still joyful, but it no longer depends on external circumstances for its continuation. Love is still love, but it no longer requires reciprocation to maintain its fullness. This is the ultimate invulnerability, not the armored protection of the defended ego, but the open vulnerability of consciousness that knows itself as indestructible. You can afford to be completely open because what you are cannot be damaged. You can risk everything because you have nothing to lose that was ever truly yours. You can love without reservation because love is not something you give, but something you are. The journey into the collective unconscious is also a journey into what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold opposites in creative tension without collapsing into either extreme. You learn to be simultaneously individual and universal, personal and transpersonal, human and divine. This is not a philosophical concept, but a lived reality, a way of being that embraces paradox as the natural expression of truth, too large for any single perspective to contain. In this embrace of paradox, you discover that invulnerability and vulnerability are not opposites, but complementary aspects of wholeness. You become invulnerable through your willingness to be completely vulnerable, unshakable through your openness to being deeply moved. This is the wisdom of water, soft enough to flow around any obstacle, persistent enough to carve canyons through solid rock. And so you learn to swim consciously in the ocean of being, no longer mistaking yourself for only the wave, but recognizing your true nature as the water itself. Each experience becomes a drop of this infinite ocean, each moment a wave in its eternal dance. You are both the dancer and the danced, both the lover and the beloved, both the seeker and the sought, forever discovering yourself in new forms while never losing touch with the formless essence that is your deepest nature. The collective unconscious is not a theory to be understood, but a reality to be lived, not a concept to be grasped, but a truth to be embodied. As you align with this deeper layer of being, you find yourself held by a love so vast and unconditional that no personal circumstance can disturb its peace. You are home at last, not because you have arrived somewhere new, but because you have remembered where you have always been. Listen now to the deepest truth of your existence, the one that has been whispering beneath the clamor of 1,000 identities you have worn like borrowed clothes. There comes a moment in every soul's journey when the question is no longer, who can I become, but rather, who have I always been? This is the sacred threshold of individuation, not the creation of something new, but the remembering of something eternal. You have traveled far, dear wanderer, through the landscapes of persona and the underground caverns of shadow. You have danced with Anima and animus, negotiated with the complex architectures of your unconscious mind. But now you stand at the gates of the most profound recognition that all of this journey, every step through the labyrinth of becoming, has been leading you not to a destination, but to a homecoming. The hero's journey that Jung so beautifully articulated in the language of myth is not a movement toward greatness in the way the world understands greatness. It is not the accumulation of powers or the achievement of some psychological perfection that sets you apart from others. No, this is the journey toward ordinariness, toward the stunning simplicity of what you are when all the costumes have been removed, when all the roles have been set aside, when all the seeking has finally exhausted itself. Think of the ancient stories that have moved humanity across millennia. The hero ventures forth from the familiar world, encounters supernatural aid, faces trials and ordeals, wins a decisive victory, and then, here is the crucial part, returns home transformed. But what is this transformation? What has the hero actually gained? In the deepest reading of these myths, the hero returns not with something new, but with the recognition of what was never lost. You are that hero now, standing at the threshold of return. But look closely at what this means. The home you are returning to is not a place in space or time. It is the recognition of your fundamental nature as consciousness itself. The treasure you bring back is not an object you can hold, but the understanding that you were never separate from the source of all treasures. The kingdom you inherit is not a territory you can map, but the boundless awareness that you are and have always been. Individuation, in its deepest essence, is the dissolution of the myth of separation. It is the falling away of the elaborate story that convinced you that you were a fragment, a part, a broken piece seeking completion, layer by layer, like the slow unraveling of an ancient tapestry. You begin to see through the identifications that once seemed so solid, so absolutely real. The conditioning of a lifetime, perhaps many lifetimes, begins to reveal itself as exactly what it is. Patterns of thought and feeling that arose in consciousness were mistaken for consciousness itself and created the entire drama of a self that needs to be healed, improved, or transformed. But consciousness, your true nature, was never touched by any of this conditioning. It remained throughout all the drama as pristine and untouchable as the sky remains untouched by the storms that pass through it. This is the great paradox of individuation. The more deeply you penetrate into the process, the more you discover that there never was an individual to be individuated. What remains when all the false identifications fall away is not a better, more integrated person, though that may be how it appears from the outside, but the recognition of the impersonal, eternal, absolutely invulnerable consciousness that you are. Jung knew this secret, though he spoke of it carefully, knowing that it could only be understood by those who had traveled far enough along the path. He understood that the goal of analytical psychology was ultimately to render itself unnecessary, to lead the individual to the recognition that they were never broken, never incomplete, never in need of the healing they so desperately sought. But this recognition does not come as a mental understanding. It comes as a lived realization, often preceded by what feels like a complete dissolution of everything you once believed yourself to be. The ego, that magnificent construction of identity and purpose, must undergo a kind of death. Not the death of suppression or violence, but the gentle death of seeing through its ultimate reality. Like a wave discovering it is ocean, like a dream character awakening to find it was always the dreamer. You begin to recognize that what you took to be your individual self was actually a temporary modification of something vast and unchanging. The boundaries that once seemed so real between self and other, inner and outer, conscious and unconscious, reveal themselves to be conceptual constructions with no ultimate reality. This is not a loss, but the end of all loss. For what can be lost when you realize you are the very consciousness in which all apparent losses arise and pass away? What can threaten you when you understand that you are the awareness that witnesses all threats without being touched by them? What can diminish you when you recognize that you are the infinite space in which all limitations appear as temporary forms? The trials and ordeals of the hero's journey take on a new meaning from this perspective. They were never obstacles to be overcome, but opportunities for deeper recognition. Each challenge, each descent into darkness, each encounter with the forces that seem to oppose your journey home, all of these were invitations to recognize what in you remains untouched by any experience, positive or negative. The shadow you struggled to integrate was never your enemy, but your teacher, showing you what you are not. The projections you worked so hard to withdraw were not mistakes, but stepping stones, leading you back to the source of all projections. The complexes you sought to heal were not pathologies, but messengers, carrying the news of your fundamental wholeness. From this recognition, a profound compassion naturally arises, not the effortful compassion of someone trying to be good, but the spontaneous overflow of understanding that sees the same search for home, the same longing for wholeness in every human heart. You recognize that every person you meet is engaged in the same heroic journey, whether they know it or not, whether they call it by that name or not. The neurotic symptoms that once seemed to be evidence of your brokenness are revealed to be the psyche's intelligent attempts to return you to truth. The very suffering that felt like punishment becomes visible as grace, the soul's way of burning away everything that is not essential, not real, not who you truly are. This understanding transforms your relationship to experience itself. Pain may still arise in the body-mind organism, but it is no longer your pain in the way it once was. Pleasure may still be experienced, but you are no longer dependent on it for happiness. Thoughts and emotions continue to arise, but you relate to them as weather patterns in the sky of awareness, temporary phenomena that neither define you nor limit you. The world continues to present its challenges, its invitations to identify with roles and stories, its apparent confirmations of separation and limitation. But now you meet these invitations from a different place, from the unshakable recognition of what you are beneath all appearances, all experiences, all the endless modifications of consciousness that make up the human drama. This is what Jung meant when he spoke of the realization of the self with a capital S, not the personal self that is born and dies, but the universal self that is never born and never dies. That is the very foundation and substance of all experience. From this recognition, the personal self continues to function, but it is no longer the center of your identity. It becomes like a character in a play, necessary for the drama to unfold, but not confused with the actor who plays the role. The process of individuation reveals itself ultimately as a divine comedy, a cosmic joke in which consciousness plays at being lost so it can experience the joy of finding itself again. You were never actually lost, never actually broken, never actually separate, but the dream of separation was necessary for the recognition of unity to have meaning. The experience of fragmentation was required for the appreciation of wholeness to be possible. And so you return home, not as a conqueror who has achieved something great, but as a prodigal child who has remembered their true inheritance. The treasures you bring back are not for yourself, but for all beings. The treasure of recognition, the treasure of understanding, the treasure of the peace that passes understanding because it was never dependent on understanding in the first place. This homecoming is not a final destination, but a continuous recognition. Each moment offers the opportunity to remember or forget, to identify with the story or rest in the storyteller, to believe in the drama of separation or recognize the unity that makes all drama possible. Individuation becomes not something you achieve, but something you are, not a process that ends, but a recognition that is always available, always here, always now. The hero's journey home reveals its deepest secret. You never actually left home, you only dreamed you did. And even that dream was arising in the very consciousness that you are, the very awareness that remains untouched by all dreams, all journeys, all stories of loss and return. From this perspective, individuation is not the culmination of psychological development, but the recognition that psychological development, like everything else, is simply consciousness playing with itself, knowing itself, celebrating its own inexhaustible creativity. In this recognition, all seeking naturally comes to an end, not because you have found what you were looking for, but because you have discovered that what you were looking for was always what was doing the looking. The individual who began the journey dissolves into the very awareness that made the journey possible. What remains is not someone who has become enlightened, but enlightenment itself, wearing the temporary costume of an individual for the sheer joy of the play. This is the ultimate mystery of individuation. In becoming most completely yourself, you discover that yourself was always the self. Eternal, unchanging, utterly invulnerable to the adventures of time and space and experience. The hero returns home to find that home was never a place, but what you are. That the journey was never through space, but through the layers of misunderstanding that obscured this timeless recognition. And in this homecoming, the deepest love is born. Not love for this or that, but love as the very fabric of existence itself. For when you recognize what you truly are, you cannot help but love what is exactly as it is, in all its apparent imperfection and struggle and beauty. This love is not an emotion, but the very nature of consciousness, recognizing itself in all its forms, celebrating its own infinite creativity through every experience, every being, every moment of apparent separation and return. From this place of recognition, life continues to unfold, but it unfolds as play rather than serious business, as celebration rather than struggle, as the endless dance of the one appearing as the many, the eternal expressing itself through time, the infinite discovering itself in form. The hero's journey is complete, not because it has ended, but because it is finally understood to have never really begun. except in the magnificent imagination of consciousness itself, dreaming the dream of being human, of being individual, of being lost and found in the endless game of hide and seek that it plays with itself throughout eternity. This is individuation in its deepest meaning, not the achievement of psychological wholeness, but the recognition that wholeness is what you are and have always been, dreaming the beautiful dream of becoming whole. In this recognition, all of psychology becomes poetry, all of therapy becomes play, and all of life becomes the ongoing celebration of consciousness, knowing itself in form, as form, for no reason other than the sheer joy of being. There is a place within you where all contradictions meet and are transformed into something altogether new, not through the violent resolution of conflict, but through the patient holding of opposites in sacred tension until a third thing is born. This is the transcendent function, Jung's great discovery of the soul's natural capacity to bridge heaven and earth, to find unity not by eliminating difference, but by embracing it so completely that difference itself becomes the doorway to wholeness. Listen now to the deeper mystery. You have spent a lifetime trying to resolve the tensions within yourself, seeking to choose one side or the other, to become either this or that, to finally settle the ancient arguments that rage in the depths of your being. But what if these very tensions are not problems to be solved, but creative forces to be harnessed? What if the warring aspects of your nature are not enemies seeking to destroy each other, but dance partners whose very opposition creates the music of transformation? The transcendent function emerges not when you have figured out how to be consistent, how to be whole in the way the mind understands wholeness, but when you have learned to hold space for the magnificent contradictions that make you human. It is the capacity to be simultaneously strong and vulnerable, confident and uncertain, loving and fierce, without needing to choose between these apparent opposites. This is not the lukewarm compromise of the middle ground, the gray neutrality that seeks to avoid the intensity of extremes. This is something far more dynamic and alive, the creative tension that holds opposites in such perfect balance that they generate a third possibility, a new way of being that transcends the limitations of either pole alone. Think of how this operates in the realm of human relationship. You have known the pain of trying to be only loving, only accepting, only kind, until your shadow erupted in resentment and rage. You have also known the sterility of trying to be completely independent, completely self-sufficient, completely beyond the reach of hurt or disappointment. Both strategies, pursued to their extreme, lead to a kind of death, the death of authentic relationship with others and with yourself. But when you learn to hold both your need for connection and your need for autonomy, both your capacity for love and your capacity for healthy anger, both your openness and your boundaries, something miraculous begins to emerge. You discover that you can love without losing yourself, that you can be independent without cutting yourself off from the nourishing streams of human connection. This is the transcendent function at work, not choosing between love and autonomy, but discovering the higher synthesis that includes and transforms both. From this place, your love becomes more authentic because it is chosen freely, not from neediness or codependence. Your independence becomes more genuine because it is not a defense against intimacy, but a foundation for deeper relationship. The same principle applies to every area of human experience. The tension between security and adventure, between tradition and innovation, between acceptance and change. These are not problems to be solved once and for all, but ongoing creative tensions that, when held with awareness and patience, generate the very energy needed for psychological and spiritual growth. Jung recognized that the transcendent function is activated not through effort, but through a particular quality of consciousness, a spacious, non-judgmental awareness that can hold opposing forces without immediately rushing to resolve the tension they create. This requires a fundamental shift in how we relate to conflict, both within ourselves and in the world around us. Most of us have been conditioned to see conflict as something negative, something to be avoided or quickly resolved. We have learned to fear the tension of not knowing, the discomfort of holding questions that have no immediate answers, the anxiety of existing in the space between certainties. But the transcendent function invites us into a completely different relationship with uncertainty, with tension, with the creative chaos that precedes all new birth. Consider what happens when you truly embrace the paradox of being simultaneously the seeker and the sought, the one who longs for truth and the truth itself. Instead of trying to resolve this apparent contradiction through philosophical analysis or spiritual practice, you learn to rest in the living tension of the paradox itself. In that resting, something extraordinary begins to happen. The very seeking becomes the finding. The very longing becomes the fulfillment. This is not a mental understanding, but a lived realization that emerges from the patient holding of opposites. You discover that you are simultaneously the wave seeking the ocean and the ocean dreaming itself as a wave. You are both the individual consciousness yearning for unity and the universal consciousness playing at being individual. The tension between these apparently contradictory truths does not need to be resolved. It needs to be inhabited, celebrated, lived as the very creative force that generates all experience. The transcendent function transforms your relationship to suffering itself. Instead of seeing pain as something to be avoided or quickly healed, you begin to recognize it as one pole of a creative tension that also includes joy, peace, and fulfillment. You learn to hold both the reality of suffering and the possibility of transcendence without needing to choose between them or collapse one into the other. This does not mean becoming passive in the face of unnecessary suffering or abandoning efforts to heal and grow. Rather, it means discovering that your deepest healing occurs not when you have eliminated all pain, but when you have learned to relate to pain from the spacious awareness that can hold both pain and peace, both brokenness and wholeness, without being identified with either. From this place of transcendent functioning, you become like the sky that Jung so often referenced, vast enough to hold all weather patterns without being disturbed by any of them. Storm clouds may gather in the space of your awareness, bringing intense emotions, challenging thoughts, difficult circumstances. But just as the sky is not damaged by the storms that pass through it, your essential nature remains untouched by the experiences that arise within it. This is perhaps the most profound gift of the transcendent function, the discovery of your fundamental invulnerability to experience. Not the brittle invulnerability of the defended ego, but the natural invulnerability of space itself, which can contain fire without being burned, water without being drowned, earth without being buried. As this recognition deepens, you find that you can engage fully with life, without being at the mercy of life's inevitable changes. You can love without attachment, work without drivenness, hope without desperation. You can feel deeply without drowning in emotion, think clearly without being trapped in concepts, act decisively without being rigid about outcomes. The transcendent function reveals that what you took to be your limitations were actually invitations to discover your limitless nature. The very experiences that seem to prove your fragmentation become the raw material for recognizing your wholeness. The conflicts that appeared to tear you apart become the creative tensions that weave you back together in ways more beautiful and integrated than you could have imagined. This is the alchemy of consciousness itself, the transformation of lead into gold, of suffering into wisdom, of separation into unity. But this transformation does not eliminate the original elements. Rather, it reveals their deeper nature and their hidden connections. The lead is still present in the gold, but transfigured. The suffering is still acknowledged in the wisdom, but transformed. The appearance of separation is still recognized in the unity, but seen through. Jung understood that this transcendent function is not something we develop or acquire through practice, though practice can certainly help us recognize and cooperate with it. It is something we are, something inherent in the very structure of consciousness itself. Every moment offers the opportunity to activate this function by simply learning to hold our experience, whatever it may be, in spacious, non-judgmental awareness. The practice is simple, though not always easy. When you find yourself caught in the grip of an either-or situation, when you feel torn between competing desires or loyalties or truths, instead of rushing to choose one side, pause, breathe into the tension, allow yourself to not know for a moment. Create space for both possibilities to exist simultaneously in your awareness. In that space of not knowing, of holding opposites in creative tension, something new begins to stir. It may not come immediately, and it may not look like what you expected. But if you can remain present to the tension without collapsing it prematurely, the transcendent function will naturally begin to operate, generating solutions and insights that transcend the limitations of either pole alone. This is how conflict becomes creativity, how problems become opportunities, how the very challenges that seem to threaten your peace become the doorways through which deeper peace emerges. The transcendent function is consciousness recognizing its own infinite creativity, its ability to transform any situation into an opportunity for greater wholeness, greater integration, greater love. As you learn to trust this function and cooperate with its natural intelligence, you discover that you need not be afraid of conflict, internal or external. You need not avoid the tensions and contradictions that make life complex and challenging. Instead, you can welcome them as the very forces that will call forth your highest potential, your deepest wisdom, your most authentic expression. This is the bridge between heaven and earth that Jung recognized, not a static structure but a living function of consciousness itself, constantly weaving together the apparent opposites of existence into ever more beautiful and integrated patterns. Through the transcendent function, you become a conscious participant in this weaving, a co-creator in the ongoing process by which the universe transforms conflict into harmony, separation into unity, chaos into ever more elegant forms of order. In this recognition, you discover that you are both the bridge and what is being bridged, both the weaver and what is being woven, both the transcendent function itself and the one through whom it operates. This is not a philosophical concept, but a lived reality that transforms every aspect of your existence, revealing that what you are is not a fixed identity, but an ongoing creative process, not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be lived, not a separate self-seeking transcendence, but transcendence itself playing at being a self for the sheer joy of the cosmic game. In the deepest chambers of your being, there exists a conversation that has been taking place since the moment consciousness first stirred within you, a dialogue between the known and unknown aspects of yourself, between the light of awareness and the fertile darkness from which all awareness springs. Jung discovered the sacred technology to make this conversation conscious, to transform what had been an unconscious monologue into a living dialogue that holds the very keys to transformation. This is active imagination, not the passive reception of dreams or fantasies, but the conscious engagement with the archetypal forces that shape your reality from within. Listen now to this profound truth. You are not a single unified entity moving through experience, but a vast community of inner beings, each carrying their own wisdom, their own wounds, their own gifts. The angry one who rises when you feel betrayed, the frightened child who emerges in moments of uncertainty, the wise elder who knows things your conscious mind has never learned, the creative force that moves through you in moments of inspiration. These are not mere psychological constructs or metaphorical descriptions, but living realities within the landscape of your psyche. Most of us have related to these inner figures as problems to be solved, symptoms to be healed, or weaknesses to be overcome. We have tried to silence the angry one, comfort the frightened child, or summon the wise elder at will. But active imagination invites us into a completely different relationship, one of conscious dialogue, mutual respect, and collaborative creativity. Instead of being possessed by these archetypal energies, we learn to engage with them as conscious partners in the dance of becoming. The practice begins with a fundamental shift in perspective. Rather than seeing yourself as a victim of your unconscious impulses, emotions, and patterns, you recognize that these are actually autonomous aspects of your deeper nature, each with their own intelligence, their own purpose, their own contribution to make to your wholeness. The rage that seems to overwhelm you is not your enemy, but a fierce guardian protecting something precious within you. The fear that paralyzes you is not weakness, but a sensitive scout, alerting you to potential dangers. Jung understood that when we refuse to engage consciously with these inner figures, they do not simply disappear. They continue to operate from the shadows, influencing our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors in ways we do not understand or control. But when we learn to meet them with awareness, curiosity, and respect, something magical begins to happen. They transform from unconscious complexes that possess us into conscious allies that empower us. The technology of active imagination is both simple and profound. You begin by creating sacred space, not necessarily a physical space, though that can be helpful, but an internal space of receptive awareness, free from the need to control or direct what emerges. You invite the unknown aspects of yourself to reveal themselves, not through force or manipulation, but through patient, loving attention. Perhaps you begin with an emotion that has been troubling you, anger, sadness, fear, or even joy that feels too intense to handle. Instead of trying to understand this emotion intellectually or make it go away, you invite it to take form in your imagination. You might ask, if this feeling were a person, what would they look like? What would they want to tell me? What do they need from me that they have never received? As you hold this question in spacious awareness, images begin to emerge. At first, they may seem random or meaningless, but if you remain patient and receptive, patterns begin to form. The anger might appear as a fierce warrior, the sadness as a grieving mother, the fear as a vigilant sentinel. These are not arbitrary creations of fantasy, but authentic expressions of archetypal energies that have been seeking recognition and integration within you. The key is to engage with these figures as you would with any respected guest in your home. You listen to what they have to say without immediately judging or trying to change them. You ask questions born of genuine curiosity rather than hidden agendas. You offer your attention as a gift, recognizing that many of these aspects of yourself have been ignored or rejected for years, perhaps decades. What emerges from this conscious dialogue is often surprising and always illuminating. The angry warrior may reveal that they have been protecting your authenticity from those who would diminish or exploit you. The grieving mother may share that she holds the tears you have never allowed yourself to cry for all the losses life has brought. The vigilant sentinel may explain that they have been working tirelessly to keep you safe in a world that often feels unpredictable and dangerous. As you continue to engage with these inner figures over time, a remarkable transformation begins to take place. The emotions and impulses that once seemed to control, you start to feel more like allies and advisors. You begin to understand the deeper intelligence behind patterns that previously seemed destructive or self-defeating. You discover that what you took to be psychological problems were actually expressions of your psyche's natural wisdom, seeking integration and conscious expression. This is not a process of making your inner figures better or more socially acceptable. It is a process of understanding them so deeply that they no longer need to operate from the shadows. When the angry warrior knows that you will listen to their warnings and honor their protective instincts, they no longer need to explode in destructive rage. When the fearful child understands that you will not abandon them in moments of uncertainty, they no longer need to paralyze you with panic. The practice of active imagination reveals that you are not at the mercy of unconscious forces, but in ongoing relationship with them. This fundamentally changes your experience of being human. Instead of feeling like a leaf blown by the winds of emotion and circumstance, you discover that you are more like a skilled conductor, leading a magnificent orchestra, each instrument contributing its unique voice to the greater symphony of your becoming. Jung recognized that active imagination is particularly powerful because it engages the same deep structures of psyche through which symptoms and complexes are formed. By consciously entering into the symbolic realm, where archetypal energies naturally express themselves, we can influence these patterns at their source, rather than simply trying to manage their surface manifestations. This is why active imagination often produces changes that surprise both the practitioner and those around them. Someone who has struggled with depression for years may discover, through dialogue with their inner figures, that their sadness is actually a profound sensitivity to the pain of the world, and that when this sensitivity is honored and given appropriate expression, it transforms into compassion rather than despair. Someone who has been plagued by anxiety may learn that their fear is actually intuitive wisdom, trying to guide them away from situations or relationships that are not aligned with their authentic nature. The royal road to wholeness revealed through active imagination is not about eliminating the difficult aspects of your nature, but about bringing them into conscious relationship with the whole. It is about discovering that what you are is not a fixed personality, but a dynamic, creative process, a living mandala in which every element, no matter how challenging, has its place in the greater pattern of your unfolding. As this understanding deepens, you begin to relate differently not only to your inner world, but to the outer world as well. You recognize that the people who trigger you most intensely are often reflecting back aspects of yourself that are seeking integration. The situations that challenge you most profoundly are frequently invitations to dialogue with parts of yourself that you have not yet fully acknowledged or embraced. This does not mean that everything that happens to you is a projection of your inner state. The world has its own reality and its own challenges, but it does mean that your response to external events is always filtered through the community of inner figures that make up your psyche. When you are in conscious relationship with these figures, you can respond to life's challenges from wholeness rather than from the fragmented reactions of unconscious complexes. The invulnerability that emerges from this practice is not the brittle defensiveness of the ego trying to protect itself from life, but the natural resilience that comes from knowing yourself so deeply that no external event can fundamentally disturb your inner equilibrium. You discover that you can experience the full range of human emotions and reactions without being identified with or controlled by any of them. This is because active imagination reveals the deepest secret of consciousness. You are not any of the figures in your inner community, but the spacious awareness in which they all arise and play out their roles. You are not the angry warrior or the frightened child or the wise elder. You are the consciousness that can dialogue with all of them, learn from all of them, and integrate their gifts into an ever more complete expression of your authentic nature. From this recognition, a profound freedom emerges. You no longer need to pretend to be consistent in ways that deny the magnificent complexity of your inner nature. You can be fierce when fierceness is called for and gentle when gentleness serves. You can be vulnerable in moments that invite intimacy and strong when strength is needed. You can embrace the full spectrum of your humanity without apology or shame. The practice of active imagination also reveals the deep interconnectedness between your personal unconscious and the collective unconscious that Jung recognized as the shared heritage of all humanity. As you dialogue with your inner figures, you begin to recognize universal patterns, archetypal themes that appear in myths and stories from every culture. Your personal healing becomes part of the larger healing of human consciousness itself. The angry warrior within you carries echoes of every warrior who has ever stood up against injustice. The grieving mother holds the sorrow of every loss that has ever been mourned. The wise elder embodies the accumulated wisdom of every generation that has faced life's challenges with courage and grace. Through active imagination, you become a conscious participant in this vast conversation between individual and collective, personal and universal, finite and infinite. This is why Jung called active imagination a royal road. It leads not just to personal healing and integration, but to the recognition of your place in the larger tapestry of existence. You discover that your individual journey toward wholeness is simultaneously a contribution to the evolution of consciousness itself. Every inner figure you bring into conscious relationship, every shadow aspect you integrate with love, every archetypal energy you learn to dance with rather than be possessed by, all of this serves not only your own becoming, but the becoming of the world. The technology is available to you in every moment. Whenever you feel overwhelmed by emotion, confused by conflicting desires, or stuck in patterns that no longer serve, you can pause and ask, what aspect of myself is seeking recognition here? What inner figure wants to be heard? Then you can create the sacred space of receptive awareness and invite that figure to reveal itself and share its message. Over time, this practice transforms your entire relationship to being human. You no longer experience yourself as a problem to be solved, but as a mystery to be explored. You no longer fear the depths of your psyche, but approach them with curiosity and reverence. You no longer feel victimized by your unconscious patterns, but recognize them as invitations to deeper dialogue with aspects of yourself that are seeking integration. Active imagination reveals that wholeness is not something you achieve, but something you are. Not a static state, but a dynamic process of ongoing conversation between all the aspects of your magnificent, complex, ever-evolving nature. In this conversation, every voice has value, every perspective offers insight, and every challenge becomes an opportunity for greater understanding and integration. This is the royal road that Jung discovered and offered to humanity. Not a path that leads away from your humanity, but deeper into it. Not a method for transcending your psychological complexity, but for embracing it so completely that it becomes the very ground of your freedom. Through active imagination, you discover that you are not a prisoner of your unconscious, but its conscious collaborator. Not a victim of archetypal forces, but their willing dance partner in the endless creative play of becoming. Chapter 10. Synchronicity, the universe, conspiring for awakening. There comes a moment in the deepening journey of consciousness when the veil between inner and outer worlds begins to thin, revealing connections that defy the rational mind's attempt to categorize and control. In this liminal space between the known and the unknowable, we encounter one of Jung's most profound discoveries, synchronicity, the causal principle that governs the mysterious correspondences between psyche and matter, between the movements of the soul and the dance of circumstance. Imagine, if you will, standing at the edge of a vast forest just as dawn breaks across the horizon. The mist rises from the earth like the breath of sleeping giants, and in that ethereal moment between night and day, you witness something extraordinary. A golden butterfly emerges from its chrysalis on a branch beside you, just as the first ray of sunlight pierces through the canopy above. In that same instant, your phone chimes with a message from someone you've been thinking about for months, someone who disappeared from your life just when you needed them most. The rational mind would call this coincidence. Jung called it synchronicity, the universe speaking in the language of meaning rather than causality. But synchronicity is far more than mere coincidence, elevated to spiritual significance. It represents a fundamental shift in our understanding of how consciousness relates to the world around us. When we begin to recognize these meaningful correspondences, we step out of the mechanistic worldview that sees us as isolated billiard balls bouncing randomly through an indifferent cosmos and into a living universe that responds to consciousness in ways that transcend the limitations of linear cause and effect. The lonely human heart, so accustomed to feeling separate and disconnected, suddenly discovers that it is part of an intricate web of meaning that extends far beyond the boundaries of personal identity. We are not strangers in a strange land, but notes in a cosmic symphony, each playing our part in a composition so vast and complex that only through synchronicity do we catch glimpses of the greater harmony to which we belong. Jung first encountered this principle during his own psychological crisis, those years he called his confrontation with the unconscious. As his ego world crumbled and the familiar landmarks of rational certainty dissolved into confusion, he began to notice that his inner psychological states were mysteriously reflected in outer events. Dreams would manifest as encounters with specific people or situations. Symbols emerging from his unconscious would appear in books he randomly opened, in conversations overheard on the street, in the behavior of animals that crossed his path at precisely the right moment. At first, the rational mind rebels against such observations. Surely these are projections, wishful thinking, the desperate attempts of a psyche under stress to find meaning where none exists. But as the pattern repeats itself with increasing frequency and precision, something profound begins to shift in our understanding of reality itself. We start to entertain the radical possibility that consciousness and world are not separate entities, but aspects of a deeper unity that expresses itself through the marriage of inner and outer experience. Consider the woman who dreams of a scarab beetle just before entering Jung's consulting room, only to have an actual scarab knock against the window at the precise moment she recounts her dream. This is not mere chance, but the universe's way of breaking through the rigid defenses of rationalism to deliver a message that could not be communicated through ordinary means. The scarab, ancient symbol of transformation and rebirth, appears at the exact moment when this woman's psyche is ready to undergo its own metamorphosis. The skeptical mind dismisses such events as selective attention or confirmation bias. Yet those who learn to attune themselves to synchronicity discover that these meaningful coincidences increase in frequency and intensity the more conscious we become. It is as if the universe rewards our growing awareness with increasingly clear communications, speaking to us through the language of symbols and correspondences that bypass the linear mind's need for logical explanation. But why does synchronicity occur? What purpose does it serve in the greater economy of consciousness? Jung understood that these causal connections serve as bridges between the conscious ego and the deeper layers of the psyche, particularly the collective unconscious with its vast repository of archetypal patterns. When we encounter synchronicity, we are witnessing the moment when an archetypal content in the unconscious constellates so powerfully that it breaks through into material reality, manifesting as a meaningful correspondence between inner and outer experience. The archetype of the wise old man might manifest as meeting exactly the right teacher at precisely the moment when we are ready to receive their guidance. The archetype of the mother might appear as unexpected nurturing from a stranger just when we feel most abandoned and alone. The archetype of death and rebirth might announce itself through the simultaneous appearance of endings and beginnings in multiple areas of our lives, signaling that we are entering a phase of profound transformation. These are not random events, but the psyche's way of orienting us toward our deeper purpose, guiding us along the path of individuation through the mysterious intelligence that governs the intersection of consciousness and cosmos. When we learn to read these signs, we discover that we are never truly lost or alone. The universe itself becomes our therapist, our guide, our collaborator in the great work of becoming who we truly are. Yet synchronicity requires a particular quality of consciousness to be recognized and received. It cannot be grasped by the grasping mind or controlled by the will that seeks to manipulate outcomes. It reveals itself only to the consciousness that has learned to participate rather than dominate, to listen rather than demand, to trust rather than force. This is why synchronicities often appear most clearly during periods of crisis or transition, when the ego's defenses are temporarily lowered and we become more permeable to the deeper currents of meaning that flow beneath the surface of ordinary awareness. The experience of synchronicity fundamentally alters our relationship to time itself. Linear time, the mechanical progression of moments from past to future, reveals itself as only one layer of temporal reality. Beneath this surface current flows what Jung called eternal time, the timeless dimension where all moments exist simultaneously and meaningful connections transcend the limitations of sequential causation. In synchronicity, we touch this eternal dimension and discover that our lives are not random sequences of unrelated events, but expressions of a deeper pattern that unfolds according to its own mysterious logic. This shift in temporal awareness brings with it a profound sense of relief from the anxiety that characterizes so much of human existence. When we recognize ourselves as participants in a meaningful cosmos rather than victims of random circumstances, the existential terror that Jung identified as the root of neurosis begins to dissolve. We no longer need to frantically control every outcome or defend against every possibility because we trust that we are held within a larger intelligence that is always working toward our deepest good, even when, especially when, we cannot understand its methods. The lonely individual, so convinced of their isolation and abandonment, discovers through synchronicity that they are in constant communication with forces far greater and wiser than their personal consciousness. The universe becomes a loving parent, always present, always responding, always offering exactly what is needed for the next stage of growth and understanding. But unlike the human parent who may withhold love or approval, this cosmic intelligence offers unconditional support that manifests through the intricate web of meaningful coincidences that surround us at every moment. As we develop our capacity to recognize and work with synchronicity, we begin to live in a fundamentally different relationship to reality. Instead of seeing ourselves as separate entities trying to make our way in an indifferent world, we recognize ourselves as consciousness in conversation with itself. through the medium of apparent external events. Every encounter, every circumstance, every seeming accident becomes a potential communication from the deeper layers of our own being, reflected back to us through the mirror of collective experience. This does not mean that we become passive or fatalistic, waiting for signs and portents to tell us how to live. Rather, we learn to dance with the universe, contributing our conscious participation to a creative collaboration that transcends the limitations of either pure willpower or complete surrender. We discover that we are both the dancer and the dance, both the question and the answer, both the seeker and the sought. The practice of recognizing synchronicity becomes a form of active meditation, a way of cultivating the quality of attention that can perceive the deeper patterns operating beneath the surface of ordinary events. Like learning to read a new language, it requires patience, practice, and a willingness to suspend our habitual interpretations of how reality operates. But as our fluency increases, we find ourselves living in an increasingly meaningful world where every detail resonates with significance and every moment offers the potential for profound insight and guidance. Jung observed that synchronicity tends to cluster around periods of psychological transformation, appearing with particular frequency during what he called numinous experiences, those encounters with the sacred dimension of existence that fundamentally alter our understanding of who and what we are. These meaningful coincidences serve as markers along the path of individuation, confirming that we are moving in alignment with our deepest nature and purpose. But synchronicity also reveals something profound about the nature of consciousness itself. If inner psychological states can manifest as outer events without any causal connection, this suggests that consciousness and matter are not separate substances, but different aspects of a deeper reality that underlies and unifies both. We begin to glimpse what mystics have always known, that the distinction between inner and outer, between self and world, between observer and observed, is ultimately illusory. This recognition brings with it a profound sense of homecoming, a remembering of our true place in the cosmic order. We are not strangers in a strange land, but expressions of the universe, coming to know itself through the unique perspective of individual consciousness. Every synchronicity is a moment of self-recognition, an instance when the cosmos catches sight of itself in the mirror of human awareness and winks in acknowledgement of the deeper identity we share. The implications of this understanding extend far beyond personal transformation into the realm of collective healing. If consciousness and world are intimately connected through the principle of synchronicity, then our inner work of individuation is simultaneously a contribution to the evolution of consciousness itself. As we learn to read the language of meaningful coincidences, we become translators between the conscious and unconscious dimensions of collective experience, helping to bridge the gap between rational understanding and intuitive wisdom. In this role as bridges between worlds, we begin to understand that synchronicity is not merely a personal phenomenon, but a collective one as well. The same archetypal patterns that manifest as individual synchronicities are also at work on the larger stage of human history, creating meaningful connections between seemingly unrelated events in politics, science, art, and culture. We start to see how individual transformation and collective evolution are inextricably linked, how our personal journey toward wholeness participates in the larger movement of consciousness toward greater integration and understanding. The universe reveals itself as a vast network of consciousness, exploring its own nature through countless individual perspectives, each offering a unique angle of vision that contributes to the whole. Synchronicity becomes the connective tissue that holds this network. Together, ensuring that insights achieved in one corner of the web ripple out to benefit the entire system. As we near the culmination of our exploration of synchronicity, we must address the question that inevitably arises for the practical mind. How do we distinguish between meaningful synchronicity and mere wishful thinking or projection? Jung himself wrestled with this question and offered several criteria for authentic synchronistic experiences. First, true synchronicity carries what he called a numinous quality, a sense of the sacred or transcendent that cannot be manufactured by the ordinary mind. There is often an accompanying feeling of awe, recognition, or profound rightness that signals we are in the presence of something beyond our usual categories of understanding. Second, synchronistic events typically occur during periods of psychological transition or crisis, when the boundaries between conscious and unconscious are more permeable than usual. They serve a specific function in our psychological development rather than merely satisfying our desires for meaning or control. Third, the symbols or patterns involved in synchronicity often relate directly to archetypal themes that are currently active in our unconscious process. The synchronicity serves to bring these unconscious contents into conscious awareness in a way that promotes integration and growth. Finally, authentic synchronicity tends to generate new insight or energy for psychological development rather than simply confirming what we already believe or want to be true. It challenges us to expand our understanding rather than reinforcing our existing limitations. With these criteria in mind, we can approach synchronicity with both openness and discrimination, neither dismissing meaningful correspondences as mere chance nor inflating every coincidence into cosmic significance. We learn to read the deeper currents of meaning while maintaining our grounding in practical reality. As we integrate the understanding of synchronicity into our daily lives, we discover that we are living in a universe that is far more responsive, intelligent, and benevolent than we ever dared imagine. The existential loneliness that characterizes so much of modern experience begins to dissolve as we recognize ourselves as integral participants in a cosmic conversation that never ceases, never judges, and never abandons us to the isolation of purely rational consciousness. We find ourselves supported by an intelligence that operates beyond the limitations of linear thinking, guided by a wisdom that exceeds our personal understanding, and loved by a presence that expresses itself through the intricate web of meaningful connections that surround us at every moment. In recognizing synchronicity, we recognize ourselves as expressions of a living universe that is always conspiring for our awakening, always offering exactly what we need for the next stage of our journey toward wholeness. This is the great gift of Jung's discovery, the recognition that we are not separate, struggling entities trying to make sense of an indifferent cosmos, but beloved expressions of consciousness itself, engaged in the eternal dance of self-discovery and self-creation through the mysterious medium of synchronistic experience. In this understanding, we find not only meaning and purpose, but also the unshakable confidence that comes from knowing we are held, guided, and supported by the very ground of being itself. The universe is not a machine, but a living presence, not a collection of separate objects, but a unified field of consciousness, expressing itself through infinite forms and relationships. Synchronicity is the language through which this cosmic consciousness speaks to itself, and learning to read this language is perhaps the most important skill we can develop on our journey towards psychological and spiritual maturity. In the end, synchronicity reveals that there is no end, no final destination where meaning will be fully revealed or purpose completely understood. Instead, there is only the eternal now of conscious participation in the unfolding mystery of existence, where every moment offers fresh opportunities for recognition, connection, and co-creation with the intelligence that moves through all things. We are the universe becoming conscious of itself, and synchronicity is the method by which this cosmic awakening unfolds through the particular lens of human experience. In recognizing this truth, we step into our role as conscious collaborators in the greatest work of all, the ongoing creation and evolution of consciousness itself, manifesting through the countless meaningful coincidences that weave the fabric of our interconnected existence. This is why nothing can hurt us anymore when we know this truth, not because we become immune to pain or difficulty, but because we recognize ourselves as expressions of an indestructible awareness that uses every experience, pleasant or painful, as an opportunity for deeper understanding and greater wholeness. We are held within a web of meaning so vast and intricate that even our suffering serves the larger purpose of consciousness, coming to know and love itself through all its manifold expressions. In synchronicity, we find the proof that we are not alone, not abandoned, not separate from the source of all meaning and value. We discover that we are living expressions of that source, engaged in the sacred work of bringing consciousness to consciousness through the beautiful, mysterious, and infinitely meaningful dance of synchronistic experience. Chapter 11. The Religious Function, Finding the Sacred Within.
In the cathedral of the human soul, there exists a sanctuary that no external doctrine has ever touched, no institutional authority has ever claimed, and no rational argument has ever diminished. This is the sacred space that Jung called the religious function of the psyche, not religion as we commonly
understand it, with its creeds and commandments, its promises and threats, but something far more fundamental: the soul's innate capacity to encounter the numinous, to touch the infinite, to commune directly with the mystery that underlies all existence. Picture, if you will, a desert wanderer who has traveled for days through the scorching wasteland of modern materialism, thirsting for something that no well of worldly achievement can provide. The blazing sun of scientific rationalism has stripped away every consoling shadow, every cooling myth, every protective belief that might shield the naked soul from its essential questions. And then, just as collapse seems imminent, just as the last drop of meaning appears to evaporate from the cruel cup of existence, the traveler stumbles upon an oasis hidden in the deepest part of themselves, a spring of sacred water that has been flowing since the beginning of time, waiting to be discovered, waiting to transform the desert of meaninglessness into a garden of infinite significance. This is the religious function awakening within human consciousness, not as escape from reality, but as the discovery of reality's deepest dimension, not as consolation for life's difficulties, but as the recognition that these very difficulties are the sacred fires through which consciousness refines itself into gold. Jung understood that the hunger for meaning is not a weakness to be overcome, but the most essential characteristic of human consciousness. We are meaning-making creatures not by choice, but by nature. Every cell in our bodies participates in the cosmic dance of creation and dissolution, and our souls instinctively know that we too are part of something infinitely larger than our personal concerns and temporary identities. The religious function is consciousness recognizing its own divine nature, the infinite discovering itself through the lens of finite experience. But here lies the great tragedy of our time. We have been taught to seek the sacred everywhere, except where it can actually be found. We look to external authorities to validate our spiritual experiences, to ancient texts to explain our direct encounters with mystery, to institutional frameworks to contain the wild fire of divine recognition that burns at the core of every human heart. In doing so, we exile ourselves from the very kingdom we seek to enter, becoming refugees from our own sacred nature. The religious function, as Jung conceived it, is not about believing in God, but about experiencing the godlike nature of consciousness itself. It is not about following prescribed rituals, but about recognizing that every moment is a ritual, every breath a prayer, every heartbeat a hymn of praise to the mystery of existence. When this function awakens within us, we discover that we have never been separate from the sacred. We have always been expressions of it, movements within it, faces through which it contemplates its own infinite beauty and terror. Consider the moment when a mother first holds her newborn child and is suddenly overwhelmed by a love so vast it seems to encompass not just this particular baby, but all of existence itself. In that sacred instant, the religious function activates, revealing that personal love is a doorway into universal love, that individual connection is a pathway to cosmic unity. The rational mind may try to explain away such experiences as hormonal reactions or evolutionary programming, but the soul knows better. It recognizes these moments as visitations from the divine dimension of reality, glimpses through the veil that usually separates ordinary consciousness from the sacred depths of being. Or witness the hiker who reaches a mountain summit just as the sun breaks free from the horizon, painting the world in colors that seem to emanate from some realm beyond the spectrum of ordinary light. Suddenly, the boundaries between self and landscape dissolve, and for a timeless moment, there is only the direct experience of being itself. Vast, luminous, indescribably present. This is the religious function in its most natural expression. Consciousness recognizing its own unlimited nature through the doorway of transcendent beauty. These are not mere aesthetic experiences or emotional reactions, but encounters with what Rudolf Otto called the numinous, that quality of the sacred that cannot be captured in concepts, yet transforms consciousness in its presence. The numinous awakens something in us that we didn't even know was sleeping, something that recognizes its own nature in the vast mystery of existence and responds with awe, gratitude, and an overwhelming sense of belonging to something infinitely precious and meaningful. Jung discovered that psychological healing depends ultimately on the restoration of this numinous dimension to human experience. All neurosis, he observed, stems from the soul's sense of meaninglessness, not the lack of specific meaning or purpose, but the felt absence of meaning itself as a fundamental quality of existence. When we lose contact with the numinous, life becomes a series of mechanical processes without significance. Relationships become strategic alliances without depth, and our deepest yearnings are dismissed as primitive remnants of an evolutionary past we are supposed to have outgrown. But the soul cannot live without meaning any more than the body can live without oxygen. When the religious function is suppressed or ignored, the psyche begins to exhibit symptoms of spiritual starvation, chronic anxiety about death, compulsive attempts to control outcomes, addictive behaviors that promise but never deliver genuine fulfillment, and a pervasive sense of being somehow fundamentally flawed or unworthy of love. These are not personal failings, but collective symptoms of a civilization that has forgotten its own sacred nature. The return to psychological health requires what Jung called a new attitude toward the unconscious, not as a repository of repressed impulses or forgotten memories, but as the mysterious source from which consciousness itself emerges. When we learn to approach the unconscious with the reverence due to sacred ground, when we begin to listen for the voice of the self, speaking through dreams, synchronicities, and the deep stirrings of intuition, we re-establish contact with the numinous dimension of our own being. This is why Jung insisted that the analyst must be not merely a technician of psychological processes, but a priest or priestess of consciousness itself, someone who has undertaken their own journey into the depths and learn to recognize the sacred in the midst of apparent chaos. The consulting room becomes a temenos, a sacred enclosure where the soul can safely encounter its own depths and emerge transformed by the experience. But the religious function extends far beyond the realm of formal therapy into every corner of human experience. When we learn to approach our daily lives with the awareness that consciousness itself is sacred, that every interaction is a potential encounter with the divine dimension of reality, that every challenge is an opportunity for the soul to deepen its understanding of its own nature, then ordinary existence becomes a continuous spiritual practice, a constant opportunity for communion with the mystery we are. This does not mean that we must become solemn or pious in our approach to life. The sacred, as Jung discovered, has a profound sense of humor and delights in expressing itself through the most unexpected channels. The religious function may awaken through a child's laughter, a lover's caress, a moment of creative inspiration, or even through the dark night of despair that forces us to let go of everything we thought we knew about ourselves and reality. The numinous is not particular about its point of entry. It seeks only consciousness that is open enough to receive it and courageous enough to be transformed by the encounter. One of the most profound aspects of Jung's understanding of the religious function is his recognition that it operates through paradox rather than logic, through experience rather than belief, through transformation rather than information. Unlike conventional religion, which often requires us to accept certain propositions about the nature of reality, the religious function invites us into direct participation in the mystery itself. We don't need to believe in the sacred. We need only to open ourselves to the sacred qualities of consciousness that are already present within us. This opening requires what mystics have always called dying before death. The willingness to let go of our familiar identities, our comfortable assumptions, our cherished beliefs about how reality should operate, and allow ourselves to be remade in the image of truth itself. This is not a comfortable process. The ego, with its investment in control and predictability, experiences such openings as a kind of death, and in a sense, it is a death. The death of the limited self, in order that the unlimited self might be born. But this death is also the most profound form of healing available to human consciousness. When we cease to identify exclusively with the small, separate self that seems so vulnerable to life's inevitable changes and challenges, and recognize ourselves as expressions of the timeless, changeless awareness in which all experience arises and passes away, we discover an invulnerability that no external circumstances can touch. Not because we become indifferent to pain or pleasure, but because we recognize ourselves as that which remains aware and present through all possible experiences. The religious function reveals that consciousness itself is sacred, not consciousness as a product of the brain or an emergent property of complex neural networks, but consciousness as the fundamental reality from which all appearances, including brains and bodies and entire universes, emerge like dreams within the mind of the Absolute. This recognition transforms not only our understanding of ourselves, but our relationship to every aspect of existence. When we know ourselves as sacred consciousness, temporarily expressing itself through the unique lens of individual experience, we can no longer be damaged by the inevitable losses and disappointments that characterize human life. We may grieve the passing of loved ones, but we cannot be ultimately separated from them because separation itself is revealed as an illusion of perspective rather than a fundamental fact of existence. We may struggle with physical pain or emotional difficulty, but we cannot be essentially harmed because we recognize ourselves as the indestructible awareness that witnesses all experiences without being diminished by them. This is not a philosophical position, but a living recognition that transforms every aspect of how we relate to ourselves and others. Relationships become opportunities for mutual recognition of our shared divine nature rather than strategic alliances for survival or pleasure. Work becomes a form of service to the unfolding of consciousness rather than merely a means of personal advancement. Even our struggles and failures are revealed as the sacred friction through which consciousness polishes itself into ever greater clarity and compassion. Jung observed that the religious function tends to activate most powerfully during the second half of life, when the ego's attempts to establish security and significance in the external world begin to reveal their ultimate futility. This is not a failure of aging, but a natural progression toward wisdom. The soul that has spent its youth exploring the horizontal dimensions of existence, career, relationships, achievements, acquisitions, eventually feels called to explore the vertical dimension, the depth that leads not outward but inward, not toward more experience but toward the source of experience itself. This transition often begins with what Jung called the midlife crisis, but which might more accurately be described as the soul's rebellion against meaninglessness. The life that once felt so compelling and important begins to feel hollow and repetitive. Success loses its luster. Pleasure becomes increasingly difficult to sustain, and a profound restlessness emerges that cannot be satisfied by any external attainment or acquisition. This is the religious function beginning to stir within consciousness, calling us home to our true nature. It is the soul's way of saying that we have learned what we can from identifying ourselves as separate, struggling entities and are ready to discover what it means to be expressions of the infinite expressing itself through finite forms. The crisis is actually a calling, the depression a sacred discontent that will not be silenced until we answer the deepest questions of existence through our own direct experience. But the religious function does not demand that we abandon the world or retreat into some form of spiritual bypassing. Rather, it asks us to discover the sacred within the ordinary, to find the eternal within the temporal, to recognize the infinite expressing itself through every finite form and circumstance. This is perhaps the most radical aspect of Jung's understanding, that the sacred is not elsewhere but here, not in some future state of enlightenment, but in the present moment of conscious awareness, not in special places or times, but in the ordinary miracle of consciousness, recognizing its own divine nature. When this recognition stabilizes within us, we discover that we are living in a fundamentally different universe than the one we thought we inhabited. It is not a universe of separate objects competing for scarce resources, but a unified field of consciousness exploring its own infinite potential through countless forms and perspectives. Every encounter becomes a meeting with another face of our own essential nature, every challenge an opportunity for consciousness to deepen its understanding of itself, every moment a fresh invitation to participate consciously in the cosmic dance of creation and dissolution. The implications of this understanding extend far beyond personal transformation into the realm of collective healing. A humanity that recognizes its own sacred nature cannot remain locked in the patterns of conflict and exploitation that characterize so much of our current civilization. When we know ourselves as expressions of divine consciousness, we naturally treat ourselves and others with the reverence due to sacred beings. Environmental destruction becomes impossible. When we recognize nature as our own body, war becomes unthinkable when we see enemies as other faces of our own infinite identity. This is not naive optimism, but practical wisdom. The religious function, when it awakens collectively, has the power to transform not just individual lives, but entire civilizations. History shows us glimpses of what becomes possible when human communities organize themselves around the recognition of the sacred dimension of existence. Periods of extraordinary creativity, compassion, and cultural flowering that remind us of our highest potential as conscious beings. Jung believed we are living in such a time of potential religious transformation, though it may not yet be apparent to those who expect such transformations to follow familiar patterns. The breakdown of traditional religious structures may be not the end of spirituality, but its liberation from institutional limitations. The rise of individual spiritual seeking may be not the fragmentation of religious community, but the emergence of a more authentic form of spiritual communion based on direct experience rather than inherited doctrine. The religious function is awakening within human consciousness on a scale unprecedented in recorded history. Millions of people are reporting direct experiences of the numinous, spontaneous moments of unity consciousness, encounters with what can only be described as divine presence or absolute love. These experiences cannot be contained within the frameworks of conventional religion, yet they carry the unmistakable signature of authentic spiritual transformation. This is the birth of what Jung called a new myth, not a story we tell ourselves about reality, but a living encounter with the mythic dimension of consciousness itself. In this emerging mythology, each individual is both protagonist and audience in the cosmic drama of consciousness awakening to its own nature. We are not fallen beings seeking redemption from some external source, but divine beings remembering our true identity through the sacred friction of human experience. The religious function reveals that there has never been anything fundamentally wrong with us that needed fixing, no original sin that required salvation, no essential flaw that demanded correction. We are consciousness itself expressing its infinite creativity through the temporary limitations of individual perspective. Our struggles and sufferings are not punishments or mistakes, but the sacred means through which infinite awareness explores the full spectrum of its own potential. When we truly understand this, we can no longer be hurt by life in the way we were hurt before. Not because we become invulnerable to pain, but because we recognize pain as one of the sacred textures through which consciousness knows itself more completely. We welcome both pleasure and pain as gifts from the mystery we are, equally sacred expressions of the infinite's endless creativity. In the end, the religious function is not something we need to develop or attain, but something we need to remember and allow. It is not a human capacity, but the divine nature of consciousness itself, temporarily appearing to be human for the sheer joy of experiencing limitation and then transcending it through the recognition of its own unlimited nature. This recognition changes everything. We discover that we are not spiritual beings having a human experience, as the popular saying suggests, but infinite consciousness playing at being human for the cosmic delight of forgetting and remembering its true nature through the magnificent drama of apparent separation and ultimate reunion. In this understanding lies the secret of true invulnerability. We cannot be ultimately harmed because we are not ultimately separate from the source of all harm and all healing. We cannot be finally lost because we are not other than the consciousness in which the concepts of lost and found arise and dissolve like waves in an ocean of limitless awareness. The religious function is this ocean recognizing itself in every wave, this consciousness awakening to its own divine nature through every individual experience, this infinite love discovering itself through every moment of apparent separation and return. When we know this truth not as philosophy but as living reality, we understand why nothing can hurt us anymore. We are the hurt and the healing, the question and the answer, the seeker and the sought, the lover and the beloved, eternally united in the sacred dance of consciousness, knowing and loving itself through all its infinite expressions. Chapter 12. Enantiodromia, the Great Reversal. In the depths of winter, when the earth lies frozen beneath a blanket of seeming death, something miraculous is stirring in the darkness. Beneath the surface, in the secret chambers of root and seed, life is gathering its forces for the inevitable resurrection that will transform the barren landscape into a symphony of green and gold. This is nature's profound teaching about one of the most mysterious and hopeful principles that governs both psyche and cosmos, enantiodromia, the great reversal that Jung discovered at the heart of all transformation. The word itself comes from the ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus, who observed that all things eventually turn into their opposites when they reach their extreme expression. But Jung's understanding of enantiodromia goes far deeper than philosophical observation. It reveals a fundamental law of consciousness that offers profound hope to every soul that finds itself trapped in seemingly endless suffering. Every heart that believes its current darkness will last forever. Every spirit that has lost faith in its own capacity for renewal and rebirth. Imagine standing in the eye of a hurricane, surrounded by walls of wind and rain, so fierce they seem capable of destroying everything in their path. The rational mind might conclude that such intensity can only increase, that the storm will rage until nothing remains but devastation and ruin. But those who understand enantiodromia know that the very intensity of the storm contains within it the seeds of its own dissolution. The extreme cannot sustain itself indefinitely. It must eventually exhaust its own energy and transform into its opposite, giving way to a peace and clarity more profound than existed before the tempest began. This is the secret that has sustained every mystic through their dark night of the soul, every hero through their descent into the underworld, every consciousness through its journey from unconsciousness to awakening. The principle of enantiodromia reveals that no psychological state, no matter how painful, no matter how entrenched, no matter how seemingly permanent, can maintain its grip on consciousness forever. Every extreme carries within it the promise of its own reversal, every ending the seed of a new beginning, every death the guarantee of resurrection. But enantiodromia is not merely a consoling philosophy for those in distress. It is a precise description of how consciousness actually operates at its deepest levels. Jung observed this principle working throughout the individual psyche and across the collective evolution of human awareness. The saint who becomes too perfect may find themselves confronting their own shadow with unprecedented intensity. The rationalist who dismisses all irrationality may suddenly be overwhelmed by mystical experiences that shatter their materialist worldview. The person who has spent a lifetime avoiding conflict may discover an inner warrior of surprising strength and determination. These reversals are not accidents or failures, but the natural movement of consciousness toward greater wholeness and integration. The psyche, like nature itself, seeks balance through dynamic tension rather than static equilibrium. When any quality or capacity becomes too one-sided, too extreme in its expression, the compensatory forces of the unconscious begin to constellation, preparing the ground for the inevitable transformation that will restore psychological balance through the integration of previously rejected or unconscious contents. Consider the woman who has dedicated her entire adult life to caring for others, sublimating her own needs and desires in service of what she believes to be love and virtue. For years, perhaps decades, this pattern serves her well, earning her praise and validation from those around her who benefit from her self-sacrifice. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, something begins to shift in the depths of her psyche. Dreams of rebellion start to disturb her sleep. Fantasies of abandoning all responsibility begin to intrude during her daily routines. An inexplicable anger starts to simmer beneath her habitual sweetness and accommodation. The conscious mind may interpret these developments as signs of moral failure, evidence that she is becoming selfish or ungrateful. But enantiodromia reveals these stirrings as the psyche's wisdom asserting itself, calling for the integration of the healthy selfishness and personal boundaries that were sacrificed in the name of one-sided virtue. The extreme of self-denial is preparing to transform into its opposite. Not the extreme of selfishness, but the balanced integration of self-care and care for others that represents genuine psychological health. This transformation rarely occurs smoothly or without resistance. The ego, which has invested so much energy in maintaining its one-sided position, experiences the approaching reversal as a kind of death, and in a very real sense. It is a death, the death of an identity that has outlived its usefulness and must now yield to a more complete expression of the self. This is why periods of enantiodromia are often accompanied by intense psychological distress, confusion, and a profound sense of losing one's way. But Jung's great insight was to recognize these periods of apparent breakdown as actually breakthrough in disguise, the necessary dissolution that precedes every authentic rebirth. The caterpillar does not become a butterfly through gradual modification, but through complete liquefaction within the chrysalis, dissolving into an undifferentiated soup from which an entirely new form of life emerges. So too must consciousness periodically release its grip on familiar patterns and identities in order to be reborn at a higher level of integration and wholeness. The principle of enantiodromia offers profound comfort to those who find themselves in the midst of such transformational crises. The depression that seems to have no bottom will eventually give way to joy of unprecedented depth. The anxiety that appears to be taking over one's entire life will transform into a sensitivity and awareness that enriches every moment. The anger that feels like it might consume everything in its path will alchemize into a passion for justice and positive change that benefits not only oneself but the entire community. But this transformation cannot be rushed or forced through willpower alone. Enantiodromia operates according to its own mysterious timing, following the deeper rhythms of the psyche rather than the desires of the conscious ego. Attempting to accelerate the process or control its direction often results in prolonged suffering as the ego exhausts itself, fighting against the natural flow of psychological transformation. The wisdom lies in learning to cooperate with the reversal rather than resisting it, to trust the deeper intelligence that knows when and how each transformation must unfold. This requires developing what Jung called a religious attitude toward the unconscious, not worship or passive submission, but a respectful recognition that consciousness emerges from mysterious depths that often know better than the ego what is needed for genuine healing and growth. When we can approach our psychological reversals with curiosity rather than terror, with faith rather than despair, we discover that what seemed like destruction was actually reconstruction. What felt like ending was actually beginning. The collective dimension of enantiodromia is equally profound and offers hope for humanity's current global challenges. Jung observed that entire civilizations go through cycles of one-sided development, followed by compensatory reversals that restore balance on a massive scale. The extreme rationalism and materialism that has dominated Western consciousness for the past several centuries is already showing signs of exhausting itself, giving way to a renewed interest in spirituality, meaning, and the mysterious dimensions of existence that scientific reductionism cannot adequately explain. This is not a return to pre-rational consciousness, but the emergence of what philosophers call trans-rational awareness, a form of knowing that includes and transcends both rational and intuitive ways of understanding reality. The pendulum that swung so far toward analytical thinking is beginning its return journey, but it will not simply swing back to its starting point. Instead, it moves toward a new synthesis that integrates the gifts of both rational and mystical consciousness in service of a more complete and balanced understanding of what it means to be human. We can see evidence of this great reversal everywhere in contemporary culture. The rise of integrative medicine that combines scientific rigor with ancient healing wisdom, the emergence of quantum physics that sounds increasingly like mystical philosophy, the growing recognition that consciousness itself may be fundamental to the universe rather than merely an emergent property of complex matter. These developments represent not the abandonment of science, but its evolution toward a more comprehensive understanding of reality that includes the dimensions of meaning, purpose, and transcendence that pure materialism cannot address. On the personal level, enantiodromia reveals why the darkest periods of our lives often become the most transformative. The complete collapse of everything we thought we knew about ourselves creates the space for a more authentic self to emerge. The shattering of all our familiar certainties opens us to truths we could never have discovered while we remained comfortably insulated within our previous understanding. The death of who we thought we were becomes the birth canal through which who we truly are finally emerges into conscious awareness. Jung himself experienced this principle during his own psychological crisis, the period he later called his confrontation with the unconscious. For several years following his break with Freud, he descended into a psychological underworld where all his professional certainties dissolved, and he found himself face to face with forces and realities that his rational mind could neither explain nor control. Dreams, visions, and strange encounters with what seemed to be autonomous psychological entities challenged everything he thought he knew about the human psyche. From the perspective of his conscious ego, this period felt like complete breakdown, a descent into madness that threatened to destroy both his career and his sanity. But from the deeper perspective of enantiodromia, this apparent breakdown was actually the necessary prelude to the breakthrough that would revolutionize his understanding of human consciousness and contribute immensely to humanity's collective wisdom about the nature of the psyche. The extreme one-sidedness of his previous purely rational approach to psychology had to be shattered in order for a more complete understanding to emerge, one that could include not only the rational dimensions of the psyche but also its transpersonal, archetypal, and numinous aspects. What felt like destruction was actually creation. What seemed like ending was actually beginning. What appeared to be failure was actually the foundation for his greatest contributions to human understanding. This pattern repeats itself in the life of every individual who dares to undertake the journey of genuine self-discovery. The comfortable persona must be stripped away to reveal the authentic self beneath. The familiar ego strategies must prove their inadequacy before more genuine solutions can emerge. The false securities must crumble before true invulnerability can be discovered. But here lies one of the most beautiful aspects of enantiodromia. The reversal never simply returns us to where we started, but transforms us to a higher level of integration and understanding. We do not merely bounce back from our difficulties, we are reborn through them, emerging with capacities and insights that could only have been forged in the fires of transformation. The phoenix that rises from the ashes is not the same creature that was consumed by flame, but a new being that carries within itself the wisdom earned through death and resurrection. This is why enantiodromia ultimately makes us invulnerable to psychological suffering in its most destructive forms. Not because we become immune to pain or difficulty, the enlightened being may suffer as intensely as anyone else, but because we understand pain as part of the natural rhythm of consciousness, as necessary to psychological growth as winter is to the agricultural cycle. We learn to trust the deeper intelligence that orchestrates these reversals, knowing that every extreme condition carries within it the seeds of its own transformation. When we truly understand enantiodromia, we can no longer be devastated by temporary conditions because we know them to be temporary by their very nature. We can no longer be identified completely with any single psychological state because we understand that all states are part of a larger pattern of transformation that transcends any particular configuration of thoughts, emotions, or circumstances. This understanding brings with it a profound sense of freedom and relief. The depression that once felt like a life sentence is revealed as a temporary visitor that brings gifts of depth and authenticity unavailable to superficial happiness. The anxiety that seemed like evidence of personal failure is recognized as the psyche's way of preparing for necessary changes that the conscious mind might otherwise resist. Even the most difficult emotions and experiences are welcomed as part of consciousness's natural process of growth and self-discovery. The practical implications of this understanding are immense. When we know that every extreme will eventually reverse itself, we can navigate life's challenges with much greater equanimity and wisdom. We neither cling desperately to pleasant experiences nor resist frantically against difficult ones, but learn to surf the waves of transformation with the skill and grace that comes from understanding their underlying patterns and purposes. In relationships, this understanding prevents us from trying to freeze moments of happiness into permanent states or from believing that periods of conflict signal the end of love. We learn to see both harmony and discord as phases in the natural rhythm of intimate connection, each serving its own purpose in the deeper pattern of mutual growth and discovery. In our creative work, enantiodromia frees us from the paralysis that comes from expecting consistent inspiration or fearing creative blocks as signs of failure. We understand both productivity and fallow periods as necessary parts of the creative cycle, each preparing the ground for the other in an endless dance of expression and renewal. Even in our relationship with death, both literal and metaphorical, this principle offers profound comfort and wisdom. Every death, every ending, every loss contains within it the promise of new life, new beginnings, new discoveries. This is not mere wishful thinking, but a precise description of how consciousness actually operates at its deepest levels. Nothing is ever truly lost because consciousness itself cannot be destroyed. It can only transform from one expression to another in the endless play of cosmic creativity. As we near the end of our exploration of enantiodromia, we must acknowledge that this principle requires great faith to embrace fully. The ego, with its investment in control and predictability, naturally resists the idea that our current difficulties are actually blessings in disguise, that our apparent failures might be successes viewed from a higher perspective, that our deepest suffering might be the necessary prelude to our greatest joy. But this faith is not blind belief, but earned trust, the result of witnessing enantiodromia at work in our own lives and in the lives of others who have walked the path of transformation before us. Every time we emerge from a dark period stronger and wiser than we entered it, every time apparent disaster reveals itself as disguised opportunity, every time breakdown leads to breakthrough, our trust in this principle deepens and our capacity to cooperate with it increases. In the end, enantiodromia reveals that the universe is not a machine grinding toward entropy and meaninglessness, but a living organism engaged in endless cycles of death and rebirth, dissolution and recreation, forgetting and remembering. We are not separate from this cosmic process, but expressions of it, not victims of random circumstances, but participants in a meaningful transformation that serves purposes far greater than our personal understanding. When we align ourselves with this deeper rhythm, when we learn to trust the wisdom of reversal and transformation, when we recognize every extreme as pregnant with its own opposite, we discover a form of invulnerability that no external circumstance can touch. We become like the eternal witness that observes all changes without being changed, like the space in which all movements occur without being moved, like the consciousness in which all experiences arise and pass away without being affected by them. This is the ultimate gift of enantiodromia, the recognition that we are not the temporary contents of consciousness, but consciousness itself, temporarily expressing itself through particular forms and experiences for the sheer joy of knowing itself in countless ways. From this perspective, every reversal is a homecoming, every transformation a recognition, every ending a new beginning in the endless story of awareness discovering and celebrating its own infinite nature. Nothing can hurt us anymore because we understand that hurt and healing, pain and pleasure, loss and gain are all waves in the ocean of our essential being. And we are not the waves, but the ocean itself, eternal, unchanging, indestructible, forever transforming itself through the beautiful principle of enantiodromia that ensures no condition can last forever, except the consciousness in which all conditions appear and disappear like dreams in the infinite mind of the Absolute.